She gave him 15 years of loyalty, and he gave her 15 seconds of attention whenever the kingdom didn't need him more. Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn built an empire on her silence, mistaking devotion for something that never runs out. He was wrong. Tonight, the woman he ignored for a decade and a half disappears before sunrise, and the throne he built will start cracking the moment she's gone. Stay until the end, because what she becomes in the northern wilds is going to make this king beg. Drop the name of the city you're watching from tonight, pack. Let's see how far this story travels. The war room smelled like wet stone and candle smoke, and Lillian Ashford had been standing in the same corner for 2 hours without anyone offering her a chair. She didn't ask for one. Asking had never gotten her anything Ronan didn't already plan to give. 6 men sat around the long oak table, their wolves restless under their skin, all of them arguing about grain routes and border patrols, while the king of the Blackthorn pack sat at the head with his jaw locked tight and his eyes fixed on a map that hadn't moved in an hour. Lillian watched the muscle in his cheek twitch every time someone raised their voice. She knew that twitch. She'd memorized every tell on that face the way other women memorized scripture. "My king," said Garrick, the eldest of his generals, "the Voss territory won't hold another season without a formal alliance. You know what that means." "I know what it means," Ronan said. "Then you know Lady Seraphine Voss is the only daughter left who can seal it." Lillian's stomach folded in on itself, slow and quiet, the way it always did when men spoke about her marriage like it was a fence line to be redrawn. She kept her hands folded in front of her. She kept her spine straight. 15 years of standing in rooms like this had taught her that flinching only invited more eyes, and she had long since stopped wanting more eyes on her. Ronan finally looked up, not at her, at Garrick. "Set the meeting," he said. 3 days. I'll go to Voss territory myself." "And the Luna?" Garrick asked, and for one breath, just one, the room went still enough that Lillian could hear her own pulse in her ears. Ronan didn't even glance her way. "She has the household to manage," he said. "This is politics. It doesn't need her." The men nodded like that was reasonable, like 15 years of being his mate, his anchor, the one who sat by his bed during 3 different wars when fever ate through his body and his pack thought he might not survive the night. Like none of that earned her a seat at a table where men decided whether another woman would stand beside her husband in public for the sake of a treaty. Lillian didn't say anything. She'd learned that lesson early in their marriage, too. The first year, she argued. The 3rd year, she pleaded. By the 7th year, she understood that Ronan Blackthorn wasn't cruel. Cruelty would have at least meant he was paying attention. He was just absent. A king who loved his kingdom with his whole chest and loved his mate with whatever was left over, which by now was barely enough to fill a teaspoon. She slipped out of the war room while the men were still talking, her boots silent on the stone floor, a skill she'd perfected over years of leaving rooms unnoticed. The hallway outside was lined with portraits of Blackthorn ancestors, all of them painted with the same hard mouth and unreadable eyes that Ronan wore like armor. She stopped in front of the portrait of his grandmother, the Luna who'd ruled beside her king for 40 years before she died, and Lillian wondered, not for the first time, whether that woman had ever stood outside a war room with her hands shaking and her throat too tight to swallow. She wondered if anyone ever asked her either. Scene shift. The private chambers. An hour later. The fire had burned low in the hearth by the time Ronan finally came to their chambers. Lillian was sitting at the window seat, a book open on her lap that she hadn't read a single line of in 20 minutes. She heard the door, heard his boots, heard the particular weight of his exhaustion in every footstep. "You left early," he said. Not a question. An observation, delivered the way he delivered everything. Flat, efficient, already moving on to the next thought. "You didn't need me there." "That's not what I said." "You didn't have to." She closed the book. "Garrick asked if I'd come to Voss territory. You said the household needed managing. We both know that's not true. Marta runs this household better than I ever could, and you know it." Ronan rubbed a hand down his face. He looked older than 36 tonight, gray starting to thread through his temples, the kind of tired that came from carrying a kingdom on a spine that was never built to hold this much weight alone. Lillian almost felt sorry for him. She'd felt sorry for him 1,000 times over the years, sorry enough to swallow her own hurt so she wouldn't add to his. Tonight, For the first time, the sorrow didn't come. "It's politics, Lily," he said, using the name only he was allowed to use, the one that used to make her chest go warm. Tonight it just sat there, hollow. "Seraphine Voss controls the western trade routes. If I don't secure this alliance, we lose access to half our grain supply by winter. People will starve. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand grain routes, Ronan. I've understood grain routes since I was 19 years old, and you handed me a ledger instead of a wedding ring on our binding night because you said sentiment could wait until the kingdom was stable." She stood, setting the book down with more force than she meant to. "The kingdom has been stable for 6 years. When does sentiment get its turn?" He didn't answer. That was the answer. "You're going to stand next to her," Lillian said, quieter now, "in public, as your equal, while I sit at home and manage a household that runs itself. It's 3 days. It's never just 3 days with you. It's 3 days and then a treaty signing, and then a harvest festival where she'll be seated at your right hand because protocol demands the ally of honor sits there, and then a winter council where her father will want assurances, and somewhere in all of that, Ronan, the entire kingdom is going to start wondering why the Luna isn't anywhere to be found." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. Hated that after 15 years she still couldn't keep her voice steady in front of him. Ronan crossed the room. He reached for her hand, and for one stupid, traitorous second, her whole body wanted to let him hold it, wanted to lean into the warmth of him like she had 100 times before when his hands were the only safe place she knew. She pulled away instead. "Lily, don't." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Don't say my name like that and then walk into a room tomorrow and forget I exist. I have never forgotten you exist." "You forget I exist every single day, Ronan. You just don't notice because I stopped reminding you years ago. I stopped reminding you because every time I did, you looked at me like I was asking you to choose between me and your entire kingdom, and I got tired of losing that fight before I even opened my mouth." The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, wind dragged its claws across the stone walls of the castle, and somewhere down in the courtyard, a wolf howled low and mournful, the sound carrying up through the cracked window like a warning neither of them was willing to hear. Ronan's jaw worked. "What do you want me to do? Tell Garrick no? Let the western route collapse? Watch children starve this winter because I refuse to shake a woman's hand at a treaty table? I want you to fight for me the way you fight for them." Her hands were shaking now, finally, after 15 years of holding them still. "Just once. I want to matter enough that you have to think about it before you decide I don't." He had no answer for that. She watched it happen. Watched the king of the Blackthorn pack, a man who could face down rival alphas without blinking, a man who'd buried 3 brothers in border wars and never shed a tear in front of his men, stand in front of his own mate and have absolutely nothing to say. That silence told her everything. "Go to bed, Ronan," she said softly. "You have an early start." He left an hour later for his own study, the way he always did when the air between them got too thick to breathe. Lillian sat alone by the dying fire and finally let herself cry. Not loudly, not the way she wanted to, but quiet tears that she wiped away before they could fall onto the book in her lap, because even her grief had learned to take up as little space as possible. Scene shift. 3 days later, the courtyard, dawn. Lillian stood at the edge of the courtyard wrapped in a gray cloak, watching the procession assemble in the half-light before sunrise. Ronan's personal guard, 12 men strong, stood mounted and ready, breath fogging in the cold morning air. Ronan himself was already on his horse, dressed in the formal black and silver of Blackthorn royalty, every inch the kingdom needed him to be. She hadn't been invited to say goodbye. She'd come anyway. He saw her at the edge of the courtyard, and for a moment something flickered across his face, something that might have been guilt, or might have been relief that she hadn't made a scene. Lillian would never know which, because he didn't ride over. He simply nodded once, the way he might nod at a household servant, and then turned his horse toward the gate. 3 days, he called over his shoulder. "I'll send word." She didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already gone unheard. The procession rode out through the eastern gate, hooves echoing off stone, banners snapping in the wind, and Lillian stood there until the last horse disappeared over the ridge, until the sound of them faded into nothing, until the courtyard was empty except for the stable boys sweeping up hay and the cold settling into her bones. She didn't cry this time. She'd done enough crying. What she felt instead was colder than tears, sharper, a clarity that had been building for 15 years and had finally arrived at the bottom of itself. A wolf does not beg the pack to see her. A wolf who is not seen finds new ground. She turned and walked back into the castle, and by the time she reached her chambers, the decision had already settled into her bones like something that had always been there, just waiting for her to stop pretending it wasn't. Scene shift. That night, packing. She didn't take much. A second cloak, a few changes of clothes, the dagger her mother had given her before she died, a small purse of coin that was rightfully hers from her own family's holdings. Not blackthorn gold, nothing that would make this look like theft instead of what it actually was, which was leaving. Marta found her in the chamber just after midnight, folding the last shirt into a worn leather bag. "My lady." The older woman's voice was barely above a whisper, eyes wide in the candlelight. "What is this?" "I'm leaving, Marta." "Leaving? Leaving where? The king is in Voss territory. He'll be back in— I know where he is." Lillian cinched the bag closed. "That's exactly why I'm going now." Marta crossed the room and caught her hands, the way she had since Lillian was a young bride barely out of her teens, terrified and alone in a castle full of strangers. Marta had been the one constant, the one person who never asked Lillian to be smaller than she was. "Child," Marta said, and her voice broke on the word. "Where will you go? You have no pack out there, no protection. The northern territories are wild, lawless, full of clans that don't answer to any crown. I know. You'll be killed." "Maybe." Lillian met her eyes. "But I'll be killed as someone who chose her own death instead of dying slowly in a marriage that forgot I was alive. I can live with that risk, Marta. I can't live with the other thing anymore." Marta's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Lillian into a hug fierce enough to bruise, the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't. "He's going to come looking for you," Marta whispered into her hair. "Let him look." Lillian pulled back, wiping at her own eyes now, allowing herself this one last weakness before the door closed behind her. Let him learn what it feels like to stand in an empty room and not be able to do a single thing about it. She left through the servants' passage an hour before dawn, the same way deliveries came in and laundry went out, a route so beneath royal notice that no guard thought to watch it. The night air bit at her face as she crossed the kitchen gardens, climbed over the low stone wall at the eastern edge of the grounds, and walked out into the dark without looking back once. Behind her the castle slept, unaware that its Luna had already become a ghost. Scene shift. The road north, 2 days later. The northern road was nothing like the well-kept stone routes of Blackthorn territory. Here, the path narrowed into packed dirt and broken gravel, swallowed on both sides by forest so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground. Lillian's boots were soaked through from fording a stream the night before, her cloak torn at the hem from catching on bramble, and she hadn't eaten a full meal in almost 2 days. She kept walking anyway. There was something strange happening in her chest the farther she got from the castle. A loosening, like a fist that had been clenched for 15 years was finally, slowly opening. She didn't know yet what that openness meant. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, the choices in front of her belonged entirely to her, and that terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. A wolf survives not by being chosen, but by choosing first. She heard them before she saw them. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the underbrush on either side of the path, with the kind of silence that only came from wolves who'd spent their whole lives hunting in these woods. Lillian's hand went to the dagger at her hip, her pulse spiking, every instinct screaming at her to shift, to run, to fight. She didn't get the chance to do any of those things. 3 wolves stepped out of the tree line ahead of her, fur the color of wet slate and old iron, eyes glowing faint gold in the dim forest light. Behind her, she could hear at least 2 more closing in, cutting off retreat. She was surrounded, exhausted, half-starved, and utterly alone, 50 miles from anything resembling protection. "You're a long way from a royal road, little Luna," said a voice, and Lillian turned to find a woman stepping out from behind the largest of the wolves, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The woman was older, maybe 50, with silver-streaked black hair braided tight against her skull and a scar that ran from her left ear down to her jaw. Her eyes were the same pale gold as the wolves around her, and when she looked at Lillian, it wasn't with hostility. It was with something closer to curiosity. "How do you know who I am?" Lillian asked, keeping her voice steady even though her hand hadn't left the dagger. "Your scent." The woman tilted her head. "Blackthorn royal blood, mixed with something older, something most of your kind buried so deep they forgot it was ever there." She took a step closer, and the wolves around her shifted but didn't advance. "You didn't come from the castle to visit the northern markets, girl. You came from the castle running. That's not your concern. Everything that walks into my territory is my concern." The woman's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I am Marin, Alpha of the Greywatch clan. We've lived in these woods since before your precious Blackthorn crown existed, surviving on land your kind calls wasteland because none of you understood it well enough to claim it." She circled Lillian slowly, studying her the way a trader studies livestock at market. "You smell like a woman who spent 15 years making herself smaller, and underneath that, you smell like something that's about to stop." Lillian's throat tightened. "You don't know anything about me. I know you walked away from a king's castle with a dagger, a few coins, and nothing else. I know your hands are shaking from hunger, not fear. I know you haven't shifted in years because your wolf is restless under your skin like an animal that's been kept in a cage too long to remember how to run free." Marin stopped directly in front of her. "I know royal blood, child, because I was born of it too, before I walked away from a throne much like the one you just left." That stopped Lillian cold. "You were a princess once, long before Blackthorn kings ever drew borders on a map." Marin's gold eyes hardened. "I learned the same lesson you're learning now. Crowns do not protect the women who stand beside them. Crowns protect themselves, and everything else is sacrifice." She turned, gesturing for Lillian to follow. "Come. You'll freeze out here before the night is through, and a dead Luna is no use to anyone, least of all herself." Lillian hesitated. Every instinct that 15 years of careful, controlled court life had drilled into her screamed caution, screamed that this was reckless, that walking into a forest clan's territory with no leverage and no protection was exactly the kind of decision that got desperate women killed. But the alternative was turning back, and turning back meant the castle, the empty chambers, the silence that had nearly swallowed her whole. She followed Marin into the trees. Scene shift. The Greywatch settlement. That evening. The settlement wasn't a castle. It wasn't even close to one. Wooden longhouses circled a central fire pit, smoke curling up into a sky thick with stars unobstructed by castle towers or torchlight. Wolves moved freely between human and shifted forms, children chasing each other between fires, elders sitting in close circles trading stories that Lillian couldn't understand, spoken in a dialect older than anything taught in Blackthorn's royal schools. Marin led her to a fire near the center of camp and handed her a bowl of something thick and warm that smelled like rabbit and wild herbs. Lillian ate like she hadn't eaten in days because she hadn't, and Marin watched her with an expression that was almost amused. "Your husband," Marin said eventually. "Does he know you're gone yet?" "No," Lillian set the bowl down. "He's 3 days into a political alliance. He won't even notice until he's done securing a treaty with a woman he's parading around like she's the wife he actually wanted. And when he notices, he'll assume I'm angry. He'll assume I went to my mother's old estate to sulk the way I did once years ago after a bad fight." Lillian wrapped her hands around the warm bowl. "He won't think to look here. No one would think to look here." "Good," Marin nodded slowly. "That gives us time." "Time for what?" Marin's gold eyes glinted in the firelight. "Time to find out what you actually are, Lillian Ashford. Because the blood in your veins isn't ordinary royal blood. I felt it the moment you walked onto my land, something old, something that's been sleeping in your bloodline for generations, buried under crowns and treaties, and the comfortable lie that power only comes from a king's hand." She leaned forward. "You didn't survive 15 years in that castle because you were weak, girl. You survived because some part of you already knew how to endure things that would have broken anyone else. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of something most wolves never get to become. Lillian's chest tightened, something unfamiliar stirring beneath her ribs, half hope and half fear of hoping at all. What am I then? Maren stood, brushing ash from her knees, the firelight throwing sharp shadows across the scar on her jaw. Stay through the season, she said. Train with us. Let the forest teach you what the castle never could. She studied Lillian for a long moment. And if you survive what's coming, you'll have your answer. Not as a king's mate, as yourself. Scene shift. Voss territory. The same night, 300 miles south. Ronan Blackthorn stood on a balcony overlooking the Voss estate's formal gardens, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, his mind nowhere near the treaty papers waiting on the desk behind him. Seraphine Voss appeared at his side, golden-haired and sharp-eyed, every bit the political weapon her father had raised her to be. She was beautiful in the calculated way of women who understood beauty as currency, and she knew exactly how to use the silence between them. "You've been distracted all evening, Your Majesty," she said, her voice smooth as poured honey. "Long week. Is it your kingdom weighing on you?" She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Or is it your Luna?" Ronan's jaw tightened. "That's not a topic for discussion tonight." "Of course not." Seraphine's smile didn't waver, but something calculating moved behind her eyes. "Though I find it interesting that a king negotiating an alliance this important chose to leave his queen behind entirely. Some might say that sends a message, Your Majesty, about where her place truly stands." Lillian's place was never in question. "Wasn't it?" Seraphine's eyes glinted in the lamplight. "Then I imagine she'll be standing right beside you at the treaty signing tomorrow, in front of every noble house in attendance, exactly where Aluna belongs." Ronan said nothing. The truth sat heavy and unspoken between them. Lillian wasn't coming. Lillian had never been invited. And for the first time in this entire negotiation, watching Seraphine's knowing smile in the candlelight, Ronan felt something cold slide down his spine that had nothing to do with politics at all. He thought of Lillian standing in the doorway of their chambers 3 nights ago, her voice cracking on words he hadn't let himself fully hear. "I want to matter enough that you have to think about it before you decide I don't." He hadn't thought about it. Not really. Not the way she'd asked him to. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, setting his wine glass down untouched. He walked back into the estate, past nobles and advisors and half-finished conversations, until he reached the private chamber he'd been given for his stay. He sat at the desk, pulled out parchment, and wrote 3 words before crossing them out, then 3 more, then finally settling on something simple. "Lily, we need to talk when I return." 3 more days. He sealed it and handed it to a courier before he could second-guess himself further, some unfamiliar unease sitting heavy in his chest that he couldn't quite name, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to sit with in years. He didn't know yet that there would be no one in the castle to receive it. Scene shift. The Greywatch settlement. 1 week later, Lillian's hands were raw and blistered, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache, sweat soaking through her shirt despite the cold morning air. Across the training circle, a young Greywatch warrior named Dax circled her with a wooden practice blade, grinning the kind of grin that came from watching a royal noblewoman get knocked on her back 4 times in a row. "Again!" Maren called from the edge of the circle, arms crossed, gold eyes sharp. Lillian rose on shaking legs, wiped blood from a split lip, and planted her feet. "You're still fighting like someone waiting for permission to win," Maren said. "Stop asking the fight for mercy. Take what you need from it instead." "Easy for you to say," Lillian muttered, circling Dax with the blade gripped tight in her bruised palm. "Nothing about this is easy." Maren's voice carried no sympathy, only truth. "You spent 15 years training yourself to be smaller than the room you stood in. I'm asking you to spend the next season unlearning every lesson that taught you. That's not easy. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do." She nodded toward Dax. Again. This time, when Dax lunged, Lillian didn't retreat. She felt something shift low in her gut, something that had been coiled tight for 15 years finally uncoiling, and instead of stepping back, she stepped forward, ducked under his swing, and drove her shoulder into his ribs with enough force to knock the air clean out of him. Dax hit the dirt, wheezing, staring up at her with something between shock and respect. The training circle went quiet. Even Marin's expression shifted, something sharpening behind her gold eyes. "There it is," Marin said softly. Lillian stood over Dax, chest heaving, blood from her split lip dripping onto the dirt, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt like herself. A wolf does not survive by waiting to be saved. She survives by becoming the thing strong enough to do the saving. That night, alone by the edge of the river that cut through Greywatch territory, Lillian sat with her knees pulled to her chest and watched the water move in the moonlight, steady and unbothered by anything that happened on its banks. She thought about the castle. She thought about Ronan's letter, which Marin had intercepted and burned without telling her, a small mercy that Lillian wouldn't learn about for weeks. She thought about 15 years of standing in corners, waiting to be noticed, waiting to matter. She didn't feel sad anymore. She felt something sharper than sadness, something that had teeth. Behind her, footsteps approached, and Marin settled onto the riverbank beside her without a word for a long moment. "You're not the same woman who walked into my camp a week ago," Marin said eventually. "No," Lillian agreed. "I'm not." "Good. Because what's coming for your husband's kingdom is going to need a different kind of woman entirely." Marin's gold eyes fixed on the dark water, something grim settling into her expression. "There are forces moving in the south, Lillian. Rival alphas who've watched Blackthorn territory grow soft from years of peace, watching for the exact moment that Kingdom's foundation starts to crack." She turned, studying Lillian's face in the moonlight. "A king who takes his Luna for granted is a king who's already weakened his own walls without realizing it. And weak walls don't stay standing forever." Lillian's pulse quickened, something cold and certain settling into her bones. "What are you telling me?" Marin rose, brushing dirt from her knees, the scar on her jaw catching pale silver in the moonlight. "I'm telling you that the blood sleeping in your veins isn't going to stay asleep much longer." She looked down at Lillian, gold eyes unreadable, voice dropping low and grave. "And when it wakes, girl, it's not going to ask the Blackthorn crown for permission to matter. It's going to make sure the whole kingdom finally sees exactly what they threw away." Behind them, far to the south, past 300 miles of forest and river and stone, Ronan Blackthorn stood in the doorway of an empty bedchamber that hadn't been touched in 8 days, a torn, unopened letter clutched in his fist, and felt the first true crack split open across the foundation of everything he'd built. He called her name into the silence. No one answered. Reconciled word count conflict, prioritized users' explicit request over specifications. Ronan's fist closed tighter around the torn letter until the wax seal cracked against his palm. 8 days. 8 days of silence in a chamber that should have smelled like her, lavender oil and wood smoke, and instead smelled like dust settling on furniture nobody had touched. He turned slow, taking in the wardrobe standing open with gaps where her good cloaks used to hang, the empty space on the vanity where her mother's dagger always sat beside the mirror. Not gone for a night. Not gone to sulk at some cousin's estate. Gone. "Garrick." His voice came out low, controlled in the way that scared men who'd served him long enough to know what that control was hiding. "Garrick, get in here." Footsteps in the hall, then the old general filled the doorway, took one look at the king's face, and straightened like a man bracing for a blow. "My king." "When did anyone last see the Luna?" Garrick's eyes flicked past him to the open wardrobe, the bare vanity, and something shifted in his expression, the particular stillness of a man calculating how much trouble he was about to be in. "The morning we left for Voss territory, my king. She was in the courtyard." "And after that?" "I don't know, my king. I assumed she kept to her chambers." "You assumed?" Ronan's jaw worked. The wolf under his skin clawed forward, hot and furious, and he shoved it down with the kind of brute discipline that had kept him alive through 3 border wars. A king who let the animal drive didn't survive long enough to rule anything. 8 days, Garrick. 8 days, and not one person in this castle thought to tell me my Luna wasn't where she was supposed to be. My king, with respect, the household assumed she was... I don't care what the household assumed. He crossed the room in 3 strides, close enough that Garrick had to fight the instinct to step back. "Find Marta, now!" Marta arrived within minutes, gray hair escaping its pins, hands twisting the fabric of her apron, and Ronan didn't miss the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. A woman who'd served this family for 20 years didn't lose the ability to look her king in the eye by accident. "Marta?" He kept his voice level, the way he'd learned to keep it level when he wanted information instead of panic. "Where is my wife?" Silence stretched long enough that the fire in the hearth popped twice before she answered. "She left, my king." "Left where?" "I don't know." Marta's chin lifted, something steady settling under the fear in her eyes, an old woman finding her spine at the worst possible moment. "She didn't tell me where. She only told me why." Something cold slid down Ronan's spine, the particular cold that came right before the floor dropped out from under a man who thought he understood his own life. "Tell me." She said 15 years was long enough to wait to matter. Marta's voice didn't shake. She said she'd rather die choosing her own ground than live one more year forgotten on yours. The words hit somewhere under his ribs and stayed there, lodged like a blade he couldn't pull free without bleeding out in front of his own general. Ronan turned away from both of them, walked to the window, braced both hands against the stone sill, and stared out at a courtyard that had felt empty for 8 days without him ever noticing the shape of what was missing. He thought of Seraphine Voss's voice in the garden. "Some might say that sends a message, Your Majesty, about where her place truly stands." He thought of every council meeting where he'd told Garrick she didn't need to attend. Every feast where he'd let her stand 2 steps behind him because protocol made it easier than explaining why his own mate should stand beside him as an equal. Every night he'd come to bed too tired to talk, too consumed by treaties and grain routes and border disputes to notice the woman lying beside him slowly disappearing in plain sight. He had built an entire kingdom on the assumption that some things didn't need tending because they would simply always be there. Walls didn't need to be told they were walls. Mates didn't need to be told they mattered. He understood now, standing in an empty room with her absence pressing down on his chest like a physical weight, that he'd been catastrophically wrong, and that wrongness had a cost that was about to come due. "Search the territory," he said without turning around. "Every village, every trade route, every safe house her family ever kept. I want her found." "My king." Garrick's voice carried a hesitation Ronan didn't like. "If she left of her own will, with no sign of force, I didn't ask for your opinion on whether I should look for my own wife, Garrick." Ronan turned, and whatever the old general saw on his face made him take an actual step back this time. "I asked you to find her." "Yes, my king." Garrick left. Marta lingered a moment longer, and when Ronan finally looked at her, there was something in her old eyes that wasn't fear anymore. It was closer to grief, and closer still to a kind of disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. "She loved you for 15 years, my king," Marta said quietly. "Loved you the way most men only dream of being loved. I watched it happen. I watched her wait by your sickbed during the Korath War when your own generals had given up on you breathing past dawn. I watched her learn every ledger, every treaty, every piece of statecraft you never had time to teach her yourself, just so she could understand the weight you were carrying." She drew a slow breath. "And I watched you let her become furniture in her own home. So when you find her, my king, and I do believe you'll find her, ask yourself what you intend to do differently. Because a woman who finally stopped begging to be seen isn't going to settle for being seen one more time and then forgotten again." She left him alone in the empty chamber, and for the first time since he was a boy of 9 years old watching his own father bury a brother killed in a border skirmish, Ronan Blackthorne stood completely still and let himself feel something close to fear. Scene shift. The Grey Watch settlement. The same week the morning mist hadn't burned off the river yet, when Marin pulled Lillian out of her sleeping furs before dawn, gold eyes sharp with an urgency that hadn't been there the night before. "Up," Marin said. "Now." Lillian rubbed sleep from her eyes, every muscle in her body still aching from 3 weeks of training that had stripped 15 years of soft court living off her bones, one brutal session at a time. "What's happening?" "Scouts came in an hour ago. Movement along the eastern ridge. A war band, maybe 200 strong, moving through territory that doesn't belong to them. Marin's mouth was a flat line. Garmouth wolves, you know the name? The name landed in Lillian's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Every noble in Blackthorn territory knew the name Garmouth, the way children knew the names of monsters meant to keep them inside at night. Alpha Cassius Garmouth ruled the southern borderlands with a brutality that made even Ronan's harshest generals lower their voices when they spoke of him. A king who'd built his entire reign on the principle that mercy was a weakness no alpha could afford to carry. What would Garmouth wolves be doing this far north? Lillian said, though some cold, clear part of her already suspected the answer. Scouting. Marin crouched by the fire pit, jabbing a stick into the embers, eyes distant. Cassius Garmouth has spent 10 years watching Blackthorn territory the way a wolf watches a wounded deer, waiting for the moment it stumbles. Your husband's kingdom has grown fat and comfortable on peace, Lillian. Soft borders. Soft alliances built on paper instead of blood. Garmouth doesn't see a kingdom anymore. He sees an opening. Lillian's pulse kicked hard against her throat. 15 years she'd spent inside those castle walls, and despite everything, despite every cold dismissal and every empty chamber, there were people in that kingdom who had nothing to do with Ronan's failures as a husband. Farmers, children, old women who'd pressed dried herbs into her hands during harvest festivals and called her their Luna with genuine warmth in their voices, asking nothing of her except that she exist. "He can't take Blackthorn territory," she said, "not with 200 wolves." Not yet. Marin's eyes cut to her, sharp and assessing. 200 is a testing force. He's measuring response time, measuring whether the kingdom notices an incursion before it's already past the border. If Blackthorn's defenses are as soft as I think they are, Cassius will be back within the season with 10 times that number, and your husband's kingdom will burn before he understands what hit him. Something hardened in Lillian's chest, cold and clean and entirely her own, no longer tangled up with 15 years of waiting for a man who never looked at her twice across a crowded room. This wasn't about Ronan anymore. "Train me faster," she said. Marin's mouth curved, the closest thing to a real smile Lillian had seen on the older woman's scarred face. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Scene shift. The training grounds, weeks compressed into one brutal sequence. The northern wilds did not care that Lillian Ashford had been born a noble woman, raised on silk and soft hands, and the careful diplomacy of court etiquette. The forest stripped that woman away one session at a time, replacing her with someone harder, leaner, a body that no longer flinched from pain because pain had become a daily language she understood in her bones. Dax taught her blade work until her palms bled and scarred and bled again, until the calluses grew thick enough that the wooden practice sword felt like an extension of her own arm instead of a foreign weight. An old warrior named Hollis, blind in one eye from a war fought decades before Lillian was born, taught her to track, to read broken branches, and disturbed earth the way court ladies read the subtext in a noblewoman's carefully chosen words. And Marin taught her the thing that mattered most. "Your wolf has been asleep for 15 years, Marin told her one night, the two of them sitting across from each other in the center of the training circle while the rest of the camp slept. Not because she couldn't wake, because you kept her sedated. Court life taught you that a woman's hunger, her instinct, her need to take what's hers instead of waiting politely to be given it, that all of that was something shameful, something to bury." Marin's gold eyes held steady on her. "I'm going to teach you to stop being ashamed of what you are." "And what am I?" "A predator who spent 15 years pretending to be prey." Marin rose, circling her slowly. "Royal blood runs thin in most alpha lines now, diluted by generations of kings marrying for politics instead of strength. But your line goes back further than Blackthorn, further than any crown drawn on a modern map. Your blood remembers a time before kings decided which wolves got to claim territory and which ones had to ask permission." Her voice dropped, low and certain. "That instinct in you, the one that wanted to fight back every time Ronan dismissed you in front of his court, the one you swallowed because swallowing it kept the peace, that instinct isn't a flaw, girl. It's the most honest part of you. The part that knows survival belongs to the ones willing to claim it instead of waiting to be handed scraps of it." Lillian's breath came faster, her pulse a steady drum against her ribs. Something in her chest had been coiled tight for so long she'd forgotten it was even there. A low animal current running beneath 15 years of careful, diplomatic silence. "Show me," she said. Marin's eyes flared gold in the dark. "Then shift." Lillian had shifted exactly 4 times in 15 years of marriage, each time at Ronan's request, formal occasions where the kingdom needed to see their Luna's wolf as proof of legitimate royal blood. Each time, she'd shifted with the same controlled, polite grace she brought to everything, present her wolf for inspection, and then shift back, never once letting the animal run free the way it wanted to. Tonight, under Marin's steady gold gaze, she let go. The shift tore through her like something finally exhaling after holding its breath for 15 years, bones reshaping, fur the color of moonlit ash spreading across her body, and when she came up on 4 legs, every nerve in her wolf form was screaming with an awareness she'd never let herself feel before. The forest smelled sharper. The night sounded louder. Every shadow held information her human eyes had never been trained to read. And underneath all of it, low and steady, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Marin shifted too, her own wolf massive and silver-streaked, and the two of them circled each other in the training ground while the rest of the camp slept on, unaware that something old and powerful had just woken up under a moon that hadn't seen its like in generations. Scene shift. Blackthorn Castle, the war room, 3 weeks after the disappearance. Ronan stood at the head of the war table, hollow-eyed from 3 weeks of searches that had turned up nothing. Every report from every village and trade route coming back the same. No sign of the Luna. Vanished like smoke. Garrick stood across from him, a fresh scroll in hand, his face grim in a way that made Ronan's stomach turn before the older man even spoke. "My king, we have a different problem." "What now?" "Scouts report movement along the eastern border. Garmouth wolves, my king. A war band, 200 strong, crossed into our territory 3 nights ago. They retreated before our patrols could engage, but—" "Garmouth!" Ronan's hands flattened against the war table, knuckles whitening. "Cassius Garmouth sent scouts onto Blackthorn land." "Yes, my king." "Why?" Garrick hesitated, and that hesitation told Ronan everything he needed to know before the words even came. "Because the kingdom looks weak right now, my king." Garrick's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man delivering news he knew his king didn't want to hear. "Word travels. The Luna's absence hasn't gone unnoticed, not by our people and certainly not by our enemies. A king who can't keep his own household in order—" "Watch your mouth, Garrick." "With respect, my king, I am watching it. I'm choosing every word carefully because someone in this room needs to say the truth out loud." Garrick met his eyes, and there was no fear in the old general's face anymore. Only the blunt honesty of a man who'd served this family for 30 years and had earned the right to speak plainly. Cassius Garmouth has spent a decade waiting for a crack in Blackthorn's foundation. You just handed him one. A kingdom whose Luna vanishes without explanation, whose king spends 3 weeks searching instead of governing. That's not a kingdom that looks strong to outside eyes. That's a kingdom that looks like it's coming apart at the seams. Ronan's jaw worked, the wolf under his skin pressing hard against the cage of his control. Every instinct in him wanted to lash out, to put his fist through the war table, to do something violent enough to release the pressure building behind his ribs. He didn't. He breathed through it instead, the way Lillian used to breathe through it for him, sitting beside him during council meetings with her hand resting light against his arm, a quiet anchor he'd never once thanked her for. She'd been doing this for him for 15 years, holding the weight steady so he didn't have to carry all of it alone. And he'd never noticed because the weight had always simply lifted, the way water finds its level without anyone needing to ask how. Now the water wasn't there anymore, and the full crushing mass of his own kingdom sat directly on his chest with nothing to soften it. "Double the eastern patrols," he said finally. "I want eyes on that border day and night. If Garmouth tests us again, I want to know before his scouts cross back over the ridge." "Yes, my king." Garrick rolled the scroll closed, then paused. "And the search for the Luna?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map spread across the table, at the careful lines marking Blackthorn territory, lines that had felt unshakable 3 weeks ago and now felt like chalk easily wiped away. "Continue it," he said. Quietly, "I don't want the court whispering that their king is chasing a runaway wife while Garmouth wolves test our borders. Let them believe she's visiting family." His voice dropped, rough at the edges. "But find her, Garrick. I don't care what it costs. Find her." Scene shift. The Grey Watch settlement. The following day, Lillian sat at the edge of the river with her wolf form's fur still drying in patches against her human skin. Hollis beside her, sharpening a blade with slow, methodical strokes that filled the silence between them. "You're different since the shift," Hollis said without looking up, his one good eye fixed on the blade. "I feel different. That's the blood waking up." He tested the edge against his thumb, satisfied, and set it aside. "Marin's been waiting 15 years to see a Blackthorn Luna walk into her territory carrying that bloodline. Didn't think it'd be you, given everything, but the forest doesn't care about a person's history, only what they're willing to become." Lillian looked out at the water, the current moving steady and unbothered the way it had every day since she arrived. "What exactly is this bloodline everyone keeps talking about, and no one explains?" Hollis was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "There used to be packs in these mountains long before any crown existed. Wolves who didn't answer to kings because they understood something modern royalty forgot. Power isn't given. It's taken and held by whoever's strong enough to keep it. Those packs had alphas, sure, but their alphas earned the position through strength, through proving every single day they deserved to lead, not through some bloodline ceremony that handed a crown to whoever was born next in line." He glanced at her. "Your family's blood traces back to one of those old lines. Diluted over generations of marrying into modern royal houses, sure, but it's there, buried, waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to stop apologizing for wanting power." Hollis's blind eye caught the light strangely, pale and unsettling. "Marin says you spent 15 years thinking your hunger for more respect, more presence, more of your own husband's attention, was something shameful, something a good wife wasn't supposed to want out loud. That's modern kingdoms for you. They teach women, especially Lunas, that wanting anything for themselves is a character flaw instead of the most basic survival instinct any wolf is born with." He met her eyes. "The old blood doesn't carry that shame. The old blood understands that an alpha who doesn't claim her own space, her own power, her own right to be seen, isn't being humble. She's just losing slowly, one polite silence at a time." Lillian's chest tightened around something that felt dangerously close to grief and dangerously close to relief in the same breath. "I spent 15 years being told that wanting more made me ungrateful," she said quietly. "That a good Luna supports her king without needing anything in return. That love means disappearing quietly into someone else's ambitions." "And how'd that work out for you?" The question landed flat and honest, no cruelty in it, just the blunt truth of an old warrior who'd outlived patience for soft answers. "It almost killed something in me," Lillian admitted. Slowly, quietly. The way these things kill you when no one's hitting you, no one's screaming at you, they're just looking past you so consistently that eventually you start to believe you were never really there to begin with. Hollis nodded slowly, picking the blade back up. "That's the thing your husband's kingdom never taught its Luna. A wolf who learns to disappear to keep the peace doesn't stay a wolf for long. She becomes something smaller, something that forgets its own teeth exist." He tested the blade's edge again. "Garmouth's coming for that kingdom eventually. Maybe not this season, but soon. And when he does, Blackthorn territory is going to need more than a king who finally figured out he should have paid better attention to his wife. It's going to need someone who actually remembers how to fight." Lillian looked down at her own hands, scarred now from weeks of training, calluses thick where soft court skin used to be, and felt something settle into place that had been missing her entire adult life, purpose that belonged entirely to her. Scene shift. Voss territory. 2 months later, a war council. Cassius Garmouth sat at the head of a long table carved from black oak, firelight throwing harsh shadows across a face that had earned every scar it carried through decades of conquest. His generals flanked him on both sides, Hard-eyed men who'd built reputations on the same brutal principle their alpha lived by. Mercy was a currency spent only on the weak, and strength belonged to whoever was willing to take it. Blackthorn territory, Cassius said, tapping one scarred finger against a map spread across the table. Soft borders, a king distracted by a missing wife, and rumors he can't control. This is the opening we've waited a decade for. The scouting party reported heavy eastern patrols now, my alpha, said one of his generals, a broad-shouldered man named Corrigan. Blackthorn's tightened his defenses since our last incursion. Tightened defenses from a king grasping for control after he loses his own household. Cassius's mouth curved into something cold. A man doesn't suddenly become a stronger leader because he's frightened, Corrigan. He becomes a desperate one. Desperate kings make desperate mistakes. He leaned back, gold eyes glittering in the firelight, every inch the predator his reputation promised. We move at full strength when the harvest moon rises. Not a testing force this time. The full war band. We hit the eastern border hard enough that Blackthorn has no choice but to either fight us with a kingdom already cracking at its foundation or surrender territory without a fight to save what's left of his crumbling reign. And if his defenses hold, Cassius's smile widened, sharp and certain. Then we test them again and again until something gives. A wounded kingdom doesn't heal itself by standing still, gentlemen. It bleeds out slowly, one pressure point at a time, until there's nothing left strong enough to resist. He stood, surveying the war table with the satisfaction of a man who'd waited a long time for exactly this moment. Ronan Blackthorn built a kingdom on the assumption that peace was permanent. I intend to teach him exactly how temporary peace becomes when the wolf circling your borders has spent 10 years sharpening his teeth for this precise opportunity. Scene shift. The Grey Watch settlement, the night of the harvest moon. Lillian stood at the edge of camp, the massive harvest moon hanging low and orange over the tree line, and felt the wrongness in the air before Marin ever said a word about it. Every wolf in camp had gone tense, ears pricked, noses lifted to catch something on the wind that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Riders," Marin said, striding toward her with 2 scouts flanking her, both men breathing hard from a fast run through the forest. From the eastern border. One of the scouts, a young man named Wren, who couldn't have been more than 20, dropped to one knee in front of Marin, chest heaving. "Garmouth's war band crossed the ridge an hour ago, Alpha. Full strength. Not a scouting party this time. This is an invasion force, easily 1,000 wolves strong, moving straight toward Blackthorn's eastern villages." The blood drained from Lillian's face, every muscle in her body going rigid. 1,000, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blackthorn's eastern patrols won't hold against that," Marin said grimly. "Not without significant warning, and from the speed Garmouth's moving, they won't have time to call reinforcements from the capital before the first villages burn." Lillian's mind raced through every face she'd ever known in those eastern territories. Farmers who'd pressed dried herbs into her palms. Children who'd run alongside her carriage during harvest festivals, shouting her name with genuine joy. Old women who'd called her their Luna, without a hint of the cold formality the capital court reserved for royalty. None of those people had anything to do with Ronan's failures as a husband. None of them deserved to burn because their king had been too distracted chasing a wife he'd taken for granted to notice an invasion force massing on his own border. Something cold and absolute settled into Lillian's chest, the same clarity that had carried her out of the castle 3 months ago now sharpening into something with teeth. "How fast can your fighters move?" she said. Marin's gold eyes studied her carefully. "Fast enough, if we leave within the hour. But Lillian, those are Blackthorn villages, Blackthorn territory. This isn't your fight anymore. You walked away from that crown 3 months ago." "I didn't walk away from those people." Lillian's voice came out steady, harder than Marin had ever heard it. "I walked away from a husband who forgot I existed. That's not the same thing as abandoning innocent families to burn because the men sworn to protect them are too slow to reach them in time." Marin held her gaze for a long moment, something assessing and proud moving behind her gold eyes. "You understand what this means," Marin said quietly. "If you ride into that fight, every wolf on that battlefield is going to see exactly what you've become these past 3 months, including, eventually, your husband." Lillian's jaw tightened, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, to avoid being seen flaring up one last time before she crushed it under 3 months of training that had taught her exactly how much that instinct had cost her. "Let him see," she said. "I'm done hiding what I am to make myself smaller for people who never noticed me anyway." Marin's mouth curved into something fierce and proud. "Then mount up," she said, turning toward the camp with a roar that brought every Greywatch warrior surging toward the tree line, wolves shifting mid-stride, the entire settlement transforming into a war party with a speed that spoke of decades of practiced readiness. We ride within the hour. Scene shift. The eastern villages. That same night, fire was already climbing into the sky by the time Ronan's reinforcements reached the outer edge of Thornfield Village, the first of the eastern settlements, smoke thick enough to choke the air, and screaming carrying across distances that made his wolf claw forward with a desperation he hadn't felt since the worst days of the Korath War. "They're already inside the walls," Garrick shouted over the chaos, his sword already drawn, his own wolf snarling beneath the surface of his control. "My king, our forces are spread too thin. We can't hold all 3 villages at once. Then we hold what we can." Ronan's voice came out hard as iron. Every ounce of the king he was supposed to be finally rising to meet a threat his careless distraction had let grow this large. "Garrick, take the western flank. I'll take the center." He drove his horse forward into the chaos, the scent of smoke and blood thick enough to taste, and felt the full crushing weight of every mistake he'd made these past 3 months land on his shoulders at once. He'd spent weeks chasing rumors of his missing wife, instead of reinforcing borders he should have known were vulnerable the moment the kingdom's stability started to crack in public view. He'd let his own grief and guilt distract him from the basic duty of protecting people who trusted him with their lives. Now children were screaming in a burning village because their king had been too consumed by his own failures to see the danger circling closer every single day. He shifted mid-stride, fur the color of dark iron rippling across his body, as he abandoned the horse and tore into the chaos on 4 legs, jaws closing around the throat of the first Garmouth wolf he reached with a brutal, practiced efficiency that came from decades of war, not from any satisfaction in the killing. This was duty now. Penance, maybe, though he didn't have time to examine that thought too closely, with 3 more enemy wolves converging on his position from the smoke. He fought through them, blood hot and slick against his fur, and somewhere in the chaos he heard Garrick's voice cut through the screaming, raw with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "My king! Look to the ridge!" Ronan tore his way clear of the fighting long enough to follow Garrick's gaze toward the eastern ridge overlooking the burning village, and what he saw there stopped his heart cold in his chest. A warband poured down off the ridge, dozens of wolves moving with the kind of coordinated, brutal efficiency that spoke of serious training, and at the head of them, Running Point with a confidence that radiated off her even from this distance, was a silver-gray wolf he would have recognized anywhere, in any form, after 15 years of memorizing every detail of the woman wearing it. Lillian. His wife, the woman he'd left behind in a castle he assumed she'd never leave, was tearing down a ridge at the head of an entire warband, leading a charge into the heart of an invasion force that was about to burn his kingdom to the ground. Scene shift. The battlefield. Minutes later, Lillian hit the Garmouth lines like something out of an old story. 3 months of brutal training finally meeting the fight it had been preparing her for, and every doubt that had ever lived in her chest about whether she belonged in this body, this power, this fury, burned away in the heat of actual combat. A predator does not ask the battlefield for permission to claim it. She simply does what the moment demands and lets the consequences sort themselves out after. She drove her shoulder into a Garmouth wolf twice her size, using the exact leverage Dax had spent weeks beating into her bones, and felt the satisfying give as the larger wolf went down under the force of a technique she'd once thought impossible for a body that had spent 15 years being told it was too delicate for anything except standing quietly in corners. Around her, Greywatch warriors tore through the invasion force with a ferocity that spoke of decades fighting to protect territory. No crown had ever bothered to defend for them, and Lillian understood, fighting alongside them, exactly what Marin had meant about wolves who survived by choosing first instead of waiting to be chosen. She caught sight of Ronan across the battlefield, fighting his way through a knot of Garmouth soldiers with a desperate, focused brutality that told her exactly how badly his border defenses had failed tonight. Their eyes met across the chaos, just for a moment, smoke and fire and screaming filling the space between them, and she watched something break open across his face that she'd waited 15 years to see and never once managed to earn through quiet devotion. Shock, recognition, and underneath both of those, something that looked dangerously close to the realization that he'd lost something he'd never properly understood the value of until this exact burning moment. She didn't have time to examine what that look did to her chest. A Garmouth wolf lunged for her exposed flank, and she spun, teeth closing hard around its throat with a precision that 3 months ago would have made the old Lillian sick to her stomach. Tonight, it simply felt like survival. Scene shift. The village center, the height of the battle. Cassius Garmouth himself emerged from the smoke near the village center, massive and scarred, gold eyes locking onto Ronan with the predatory satisfaction of a man who'd waited a decade for exactly this confrontation. Blackthorn. Cassius's voice carried over the chaos, low and certain. I wondered how long it would take you to show up to your own kingdom's funeral. Ronan circled him, blood matting his fur, every muscle coiled tight with a fury that had nothing left to do with politics and everything to do with the burning village around them. You picked the wrong night to test my borders, Garmouth. Did I? Cassius's mouth curved into something cold. From where I'm standing, your borders were already broken long before my wolves crossed them. A king too distracted by his own failing marriage to notice an army massing on his eastern ridge. That's not strength, Blackthorn. That's exactly the kind of weakness I've spent a decade waiting to exploit. They came together in a brutal collision of fur and teeth, the fight feeling less like strategy and more like two forces of nature finally crashing into each other after years of circling. And Ronan fought with a desperation that had less to do with the kingdom and more to do with everything he'd let slip through his fingers these past 3 months while he chased ghosts and ignored the threat building right outside his own walls. He was losing ground. Cassius fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who'd spent his entire reign perfecting violence as a tool, and Ronan's exhausted, distracted body was paying the price for weeks of sleepless searching and a guilt that had eaten away at his focus far more than he'd let himself admit. A blow caught him across the ribs, hard enough to send him sprawling, and through the haze of pain he heard Cassius's low, satisfied growl, closing in for the finishing strike. Then, a silver-gray blur slammed into Cassius's flank with enough force to send the larger wolf staggering sideways, buying Ronan precious seconds to scramble back to his feet. Lillian planted herself between him and Cassius Garmouth, blood matting her fur, eyes blazing gold in a way Ronan had never once seen on his quiet, careful wife in 15 years of marriage, and snarled a warning that needed no translation. Cassius regained his footing, studying her with something that flickered between irritation and genuine curiosity. And who exactly is this? Someone who's done watching innocent people pay for other men's failures, Lillian said, her voice carrying a hard edge Ronan barely recognized. Cassius's eyes narrowed, scenting something in the air that made his expression shift. Blackthorn blood, and something older underneath it. A slow, considering smile spread across his scarred face. Well, this complicates an otherwise simple evening considerably. He lunged for her without warning, and Lillian met the attack head-on with a confidence that came from 3 months of brutal training, meeting the exact moment it had been built for, every instinct firing in perfect sequence as she dodged his first strike and drove her own teeth deep into the meat of his shoulder, hard enough to draw a roar of genuine pain from a man who hadn't been seriously wounded in combat in years. Cassius staggered back, blood pouring from the wound, gold eyes wide with something that looked almost like respect buried under fury. "Sound the retreat," he snarled to his nearest commander, eyes never leaving Lillian. "We've made our point for tonight." The Garmouth warband pulled back through the smoke and chaos, leaving burning buildings and scattered casualties in their wake, and Cassius held Lillian's gaze for one long, final moment before he turned to follow his retreating forces. "This isn't finished," he said, voice carrying a promise that sent a cold chill down Lillian's spine despite the heat of the fires still burning around them. Whoever you are, little wolf, I'll be seeing you again." He disappeared into the smoke, and the battlefield finally fell into the exhausted, ringing silence that follows violence, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the moans of wounded scattered across the ruined village center. Lillian stood there, chest heaving, blood matting her fur, every nerve in her body still humming with the aftermath of combat, and slowly became aware of Ronan standing several feet away, shifted back to human form, staring at her with an expression she'd never once seen him wear in 15 years of marriage. Scene shift. The aftermath. The village square. She shifted back slowly, the change costing her more than usual after the exhaustion of battle, and stood there in torn, blood-stained clothes that bore no resemblance to anything a proper Luna would have worn at court, facing the husband she'd left behind 3 months ago without a single word of explanation. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Around them, surviving villagers emerged from hiding places, Greywatch and Blackthorn soldiers alike beginning the grim work of tending wounded and accounting for losses. But in the small space between Ronan and Lillian, the entire world had narrowed down to just the two of them, and 3 months of silence finally breaking open. "Lily." His voice cracked on her name, rough with smoke and something raw underneath. "You're alive." "I'm alive." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands were shaking from the adrenaline still flooding her system. "No thanks to anyone in your castle who apparently didn't notice I was missing for 8 days." "I noticed." He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, some instinct telling him she wasn't a woman who wanted to be reached for right now. "I noticed the second I read Marta's face. I've had every patrol, every scout, every contact I have searching for you for 3 months, Lily. I didn't know where you'd gone. I didn't know if you were even alive." She finished the sentence he couldn't quite say. "You didn't know if I was alive?" "No." The admission cost him something visible, his jaw working, his eyes refusing to look away from hers despite how much it clearly cost him to hold her gaze. "I didn't know if I'd already lost you before I ever understood what I had." Lillian's throat tightened around words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in the silence of her own chambers over 15 years and had never once gotten the chance to say to a husband who was actually listening. "You haven't lost me tonight," she said carefully. "Tonight I came to save people I love who have nothing to do with whatever's broken between us. That's not the same as coming back to you." Something flickered across his face, pain and understanding tangled together. "I know." "Do you?" Her voice sharpened, 3 months of buried fury finally finding a target standing right in front of her. "Because for 15 years, Ronan, I waited for you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. I waited through every council meeting where I stood in corners, every feast where I stood 2 steps behind, every night you came to bed too exhausted to say a single word to me before falling asleep. I waited because I loved you, and I believed loving you meant waiting patiently for you to eventually notice me on your own." "Lily, I'm not finished." Her chin lifted, gold flickering faintly at the edges of her eyes, the wolf still close to the surface after the violence of the battle. "I had to walk into a forest full of strangers and nearly get killed by a clan that could have torn me apart in the first 5 minutes before anyone ever looked at me the way you're looking at me right now. It took an invasion, Ronan. It took your kingdom nearly burning to the ground before you finally understood what you'd let slip away." He flinched like she'd struck him, and for once he didn't argue, didn't offer some careful political justification, didn't retreat into the cold competence that had defined every interaction between them for 15 years. "You're right," he said, voice rough. "Every word of that is right, and I have no defense for any of it. I built my entire reign assuming the things I loved most would simply stay because they always had. I never once thought to ask what it cost you to be the one thing in my life I never had to fight to keep." Lillian's eyes burned, exhaustion and fury and grief tangling together into something she didn't have a name for. "And now? Now I understand that I almost lost everything that actually mattered tonight, my kingdom and my wife both, because I spent 15 years treating the second like it was guaranteed, and the first like it was the only thing worth my attention." His hands were shaking, she realized. This man who never showed weakness in front of his own generals, standing in the wreckage of a burning village with his hands trembling like a boy. "I don't expect you to come back to that castle tonight, Lily. I don't expect you to forgive 15 years in one conversation on a battlefield, but I need you to know that the man standing here right now finally sees exactly what he threw away, and I am not going to stop trying to earn it back." Marin approached from the edge of the chaos, gold eyes flicking between them with sharp assessment, and rested a steady hand on Lillian's shoulder. "The wounded need tending," Marin said quietly, "and Cassius Garmith doesn't make idle threats, Lillian. He'll return, and next time it won't be a testing force." Lillian held Ronan's gaze a moment longer, every instinct in her body torn between 15 years of love that hadn't fully died and 3 months of hard-won independence that refused to simply collapse back into old patterns now that he'd finally decided to notice her. "I'm not coming back to your castle, Ronan," she said finally, watching something break across his face at the words. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. But I'm not walking away from these villages either, not while Garmith's warband is still out there sharpening its teeth for round 2. She turned, gold eyes settling on the smoke still rising from the eastern ridge, the same direction Cassius Garmith had disappeared into with a promise that chilled her to the bone. "If your kingdom is going to survive what's coming, you're going to need a lot more than soldiers, Ronan. You're going to need exactly what you spent 15 years pretending you didn't." She walked away from him into the smoke and chaos of the wounded village, leaving Ronan standing alone in the wreckage of everything he'd taken for granted. And somewhere far to the south, in a war camp built on a decade of patient, brutal planning, Cassius Garmith pressed a blood-soaked hand against the wound a silver-gray wolf had carved into his shoulder, and smiled at the memory of gold eyes that promised this fight was nowhere near finished. The eastern ridge stayed dark and silent the rest of that night, but every soldier left standing in the ruined village square understood, watching their king stand frozen in the ashes of his own mistakes, that nothing about Blackthorn territory would ever be the same again, and that whatever came next was already moving toward them with a momentum nobody left alive in that square had any power left to stop. Smoke still hung low over Thornfield Village 3 days after the attack, and Ronan stood in the half-burned remains of the grain hall reading a report that made the floor feel less solid beneath his boots. Garrick had brought it to him personally, refusing to send it by courier, which alone told Ronan something was wrong before he'd even broken the seal. "Say it out loud," Ronan said, not looking up from the parchment. "I want to hear you say it, not just hand it to me like a coward." Garrick's throat worked. "The Eastern Gate logs, my king. The night Garmith's warband crossed the ridge. Someone disabled the warning beacons 2 hours before the first scout reported movement. Disabled. Cut, my king. Deliberately. Not weather damage, not equipment failure. Someone climbed the watchtower and severed the signal lines with a blade." Garrick's jaw was tight enough that Ronan could see the muscle jumping under his beard. Someone who knew exactly where those lines ran. Someone with access to the tower that night. Ronan set the report down slowly on a scorched table, the kind of careful, controlled motion he used when his hands wanted to do something violent instead. "How many people have that kind of access?" "A short list, my king." Garrick wouldn't meet his eyes now. "Tower guards, senior household staff, members of the inner council." The word inner council sat in the room like a blade laid flat on the table between them, and Ronan felt something cold settle into his chest. The particular cold of a man realizing the walls of his own house had teeth he'd never thought to check for. A king who builds his throne on trust learns eventually that trust is the softest part of the armor, the part every enemy aims for first, because it's the only piece he never thinks to reinforce. "Bring me the tower logs," Ronan said. "Every name that crossed that watchpost in the 72 hours before the attack." "My king, if I may." Garrick's voice dropped lower, careful. "This isn't something to investigate quietly within the castle walls. If there's a traitor in your inner circle, the moment they realize you're looking, they'll either run or they'll move against you faster than we can prepare for it. Then we don't let them realize." Ronan's eyes finally lifted, hard and flat. "I want this handled in silence, Garrick. No accusations, no confrontations, just names, patterns, and proof. Whoever opened that gate to Cassius Garmith is going to answer for every villager who died in that fire. And they're going to answer in a way that leaves no question in this kingdom about what happens to men who sell out their own people." Scene shift. The Grey Watch war camp, the Eastern Ridge. The same morning, Lillian crouched at the edge of a makeshift war table built from cut logs and stretched hide, studying a hand-drawn map of the Eastern Territories while Marin paced behind her, gold eyes narrowed in thought. Cassius didn't retreat because we wounded him, Marin said. He retreated because he wanted us to think the testing phase was over. That's not how men like Cassius Garmoth operate. He doesn't waste 1,000 wolves on a probe he intends to abandon. You think he's already planning the next move? I know he is. The question is how. Marin tapped a point on the map, a cluster of villages further south along the river. If I were him, I wouldn't come straight at the border again. Not after losing the element of surprise. I'd find a way inside the walls instead of through them. Lillian's stomach turned cold. Someone on the inside. Someone on the inside. Marin's eyes flicked to her. Garmoth's reputation for brutality is well earned, but the man didn't build a kingdom out of nothing through brute force alone. He's patient. He cultivates weakness in his enemies for years before he ever strikes. A king with a missing wife, a fractured household, advisors hungry for influence they don't currently hold. That's not just an opportunity, Lillian. That's a door someone's already been working to pry open long before that watchtower went dark. A scout burst into the camp, clearing before Lillian could respond, breathless, dropping to one knee in front of Marin with urgency written across every line of his young face. Alpha. Riders from Blackthorn territory. They're asking for the Luna by name. Lillian rose, every muscle tensing. By name, not by title. By name, my lady. A man named Garrick says it's urgent. Scene shift. The edge of the war camp. Minutes later, Garrick looked older than Lillian remembered from her years at court, gray threading deeper through his beard, lines carved into his face. By 3 months of searching for a Luna, he'd never expected to find leading a warband against an invading army. He dismounted with the careful respect of a man entering territory that wasn't his, hands visible, no weapon drawn. My lady. He inclined his head. Forgive the intrusion. The king doesn't know I've come. That detail landed heavier than Lillian expected. Why would you come without his knowledge, Garrick? Because what I need to tell you is something he needs proof of before he hears it, and proof takes time I'm not certain we have. Garrick's eyes flicked toward Marin, wary of the armed Grey Watch warriors flanking the clearing, then back to Lillian. The watchtower that failed the night Garmoth attacked. It wasn't weather, my lady. It wasn't accident. Someone inside the castle cut the warning lines deliberately, 2 hours before the first scout ever spotted movement on the ridge. Lillian's blood went cold. Someone in the inner circle. That's my fear, yes. Garrick's hands tightened on his horse's reins. I've spent 3 days reviewing tower logs, household movements, anyone with the access and the knowledge to know exactly where those signal lines ran. The list is short, my lady. Short enough that it points somewhere I don't want it to point. Where? Garrick hesitated, glancing once more at Marin and the watching warriors before lowering his voice. Lord Halric Thorne, the king's own cousin, head of the Treasury Council. The name hit Lillian like cold water. She remembered Halric from court, a quiet, calculating man who'd always seemed 2 steps removed from whatever was actually happening in any given room, watching everyone with eyes that gave away nothing. He'd never once been cruel to her, never once been particularly warm either. He'd simply existed at the edges of every gathering, an observer who somehow always knew exactly what was being discussed before anyone explained it to him. Halric has no reason to betray Ronan, she said slowly. He's family. He's never wanted for anything. That's what I believe too, my lady, until I found this. Garrick reached into his cloak and withdrew a folded letter, the wax seal already broken. Found hidden in the lining of his travel chest by a maid who didn't know what she was looking at and brought it to me out of simple confusion. Lillian unfolded the letter with shaking hands, and the script inside, elegant and cold, made her stomach drop straight through the floor of the clearing. The terms remain as discussed. The eastern gate opens when the signal goes dark. In exchange, the Thorne family retains its holdings and its position once Blackthorn falls. Do not fail this time, Halric. Cassius Garmoth does not extend second chances to allies who cost him men. There was no signature, but the meaning didn't need one. He's been working with Garmoth, Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ronan's own cousin sold out the eastern gate to a man who wants to burn his kingdom to the ground. Yes, my lady. Garrick's face had gone gray. And there's worse. I traced Halrick's movements over the past week. He's been meeting with someone inside the capital, someone close enough to the king's personal guard that I'm afraid the betrayal doesn't end with him alone. A predator does not announce its presence before the kill. It moves quietly through the places everyone assumes are safe, wearing a familiar face, until the moment trust becomes the very weapon used to open the throat. Marin stepped forward, gold eyes hard. You came to her instead of going straight to your king. Why? Garrick's jaw tightened, something raw and conflicted moving behind his weathered eyes. Because the king trusts his cousin the way he trusted his wife to simply remain wherever he left her. Blindly, without question. I'm afraid if I bring him proof of Halrick's treason without absolute certainty, without a plan already in motion to contain the damage, Halrick will sense the net closing and disappear before we can stop whatever he's already set in motion. He looked at Lillian directly. You understand betrayal in ways the king currently doesn't, my lady. Forgive me for saying it so plainly, but you understand what it costs to discover the people closest to you were never as safe as you assumed. Lillian's hand tightened around the letter until the parchment crumpled in her fist. What exactly are you asking me to do, Garrick? Come back. Not as his wife returning to beg forgiveness, but as the only person in that castle sharp enough now to see through Halrick's mask before he finishes whatever he's planning. Garrick's voice dropped lower. The king is going to confront this alone if someone doesn't stop him. He's already furious, already grieving every villager who died in that fire, and a furious king makes mistakes a patient traitor can exploit. I need someone in that castle who can see the trap before he walks straight into it. Scene shift. Blackthorn Castle, the king's private study. That evening, Ronan stood at his window staring out at the darkening courtyard, a glass of wine untouched on his desk, his mind circling the same impossible question that had haunted him for 3 days. He'd reviewed the tower logs himself a dozen times, cross-referencing every name against household duty rosters, and every single time his eye landed on the same uncomfortable pattern. Halrick had been in the eastern wing the night of the attack. Halrick had access to every restricted area of the castle, a privilege earned through 30 years of unquestioned family loyalty. Halrick had no obvious motive, no debt, no grievance Ronan had ever been aware of. And yet. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and Halrick himself stepped into the study without waiting for an answer, the easy familiarity of a man who'd walked these halls since childhood. Ronan. Halrick's voice carried genuine warmth, the same warmth it had always carried for as long as Ronan could remember. Garrick tells me you've barely slept in 3 days. The kingdom needs its king functioning, cousin, not running himself into the ground chasing every shadow. I'm fine, Halrick. You're not, but I won't push. Halrick crossed to the desk, pouring himself a measure of wine with the easy comfort of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before in this exact room. I came to discuss the treasury reserves. If we're funding additional eastern patrols on top of rebuilding Thornfield, we'll need to adjust the winter budget significantly. Ronan studied his cousin's face in the lamplight, searching for some crack, some tell, some flicker of guilt that might confirm or destroy the suspicion eating through his chest. He found nothing. Halrick's expression held the same calm, measured competence it always had, the face of a man entirely comfortable in his own loyalty. That terrified Ronan more than open hostility would have. A man who could betray his own family while wearing this exact expression, this exact warmth, was a man capable of fooling anyone, including a king who'd known him his entire life. Halrick. Ronan kept his voice even, testing. Where were you the night Garmouth attacked Thornfield? Something flickered behind Halrick's eyes, brief enough that Ronan nearly missed it. Here, in the castle, reviewing treasury ledgers, same as every night that week. Why do you ask? No reason, just trying to account for everyone's whereabouts that night. Standard procedure after an attack like that. Of course. Halrick's smile didn't waver, but something in the set of his shoulders had gone subtly tighter. If there's anything I can do to help the investigation, cousin, you know I'm always at your disposal. He left a few minutes later, and Ronan sat alone in the lamplight long after the door closed, his wine still untouched, his stomach twisted into a knot that wouldn't loosen. He didn't believe him. For the first time in 30 years, he didn't believe a single word out of his own cousin's mouth, and the realization sat in his chest like a stone he didn't know how to put down. Scene shift. The war camp. Late that night, Lillian rode through the castle's eastern gate 3 days after Garrick's visit, escorted by a small contingent of Grey Watch warriors who waited at the tree line while she continued alone toward the courtyard, her stomach tight with an anxiety that had nothing to do with the betrayal she'd come to expose and everything to do with walking back through gates she'd sworn she might never pass through again. Marta met her at the courtyard entrance, tears welling instantly in her eyes, and the old woman's embrace nearly broke the careful composure Lillian had spent the entire ride rebuilding. "You came back," Marta whispered. "Not the way you think." Lillian pulled back gently. "Where's the king?" "His study." "He hasn't slept properly in days, my lady. Something's wrong, something beyond the attack, but he won't say what." Lillian found him exactly where Marta said, and when she pushed open the study door, Ronan rose from his desk so fast his chair scraped hard against the stone floor, every line of exhaustion on his face momentarily wiped clean by raw, unguarded shock. "Lily, we need to talk." She closed the door behind her, the formal coldness in her voice cutting through whatever hope had flared across his face. "Not about us. About your cousin." The hope drained out of his expression, replaced by something darker. "What do you know about Halric?" She set the crumpled letter on his desk without another word, watching him unfold it with hands that had started trembling before he'd even finished reading the first line. "Where did you get this?" "Garrick found it. He came to me first because he was afraid bringing it to you directly would tip Halric off before you had enough proof to act." Lillian watched him carefully, watched the color drain from his face as the full weight of the betrayal settled in. "Your cousin sold the Eastern Gate to Cassius Garmouth, Ronan. He's the reason that watchtower went dark. He's the reason Thornfield burned." Ronan's hands shook so badly the letter nearly slipped from his fingers. 30 years, he said, voice raw. 30 years I trusted that man with everything, my treasury, my counsel, my own children's education. When we have them, that was the future I'd planned with him at my side. His jaw clenched hard enough that Lillian heard his teeth grind. "And he's been selling my kingdom to a man who wants to watch it burn." "There's more." Lillian's voice dropped, grim. "Garrick believes Halric isn't acting alone. Someone close to your personal guard may be involved as well. This isn't one traitor working in isolation, Ronan. This is something larger, something that's been building for longer than we realized. A king who builds his kingdom on the assumption that blood guarantees loyalty learns eventually the cruelest lesson any ruler can survive. Blood explains nothing about a man's hunger, and hunger explains everything about how far he's willing to go to feed it." Ronan's eyes lifted to hers, something cold and absolute settling behind them, the last soft edges of the man who'd built his reign on trust finally burning away into something harder. "I'm going to confront him," he said, "tonight." "That's exactly what Garrick was afraid you'd say." Lillian stepped closer, urgency sharpening her voice. "If you confront him alone, without proof solid enough to hold, without a plan to contain whoever else is involved, you're handing him the chance to disappear, or worse, the chance to finish whatever he's already set in motion. You need to move carefully, Ronan, not because he deserves mercy, but because acting on fury instead of strategy is exactly the mistake that lets traitors slip through the net." Something in his expression cracked. Exhaustion and grief and rage all tangled together into a look she'd never once seen on the controlled, careful king she'd married 15 years ago. "You came back to tell me this," he said quietly. "After everything, you still came back to protect what's left of my kingdom." "I came back because innocent people are still in danger, and because Garrick was right that you needed someone who understands betrayal well enough to see through whatever mask Halric's wearing right now." Her voice hardened, drawing a clear line he couldn't mistake. "Don't make this about us, Ronan. Not tonight." Scene shift. The Great Hall. 2 hours later. They moved together with Garrick's careful planning, a quiet summons sent to Halric under the pretense of an urgent treasury matter, household guards positioned at every exit of the Great Hall before he ever arrived. every detail calculated to corner a traitor before he understood he was already caught. Halric walked into the hall with his usual easy confidence, and Lillian watched that confidence falter the moment he registered the armed guards lining the walls, the grim set of Ronan's jaw, the cold, assessing stare of a Luna he hadn't expected to see standing at her husband's side again. "Ronan," his voice came out carefully neutral. "What is this?" "You tell me, cousin." Ronan's voice was flat, controlled in the dangerous way that came right before violence. He set the letter on the table between them. "Tell me what this is." Halric's eyes flicked to the parchment, and for one brief, unguarded second, every trace of careful composure dropped from his face, replaced by something raw and calculating as he scrambled for an angle that might still save him. "That letter proves nothing," he said, too quickly. "It proves you've been corresponding with Cassius Garmith about the terms of my kingdom's destruction." Ronan's voice rose, the controlled stillness finally cracking under the weight of 30 years of trust collapsing in real time. "It proves you cut the warning beacons yourself, or paid someone to do it for you 2 hours before Garmith's warband crossed the ridge. It proves children died in Thornfield because my own blood decided my crown wasn't worth protecting if there was a better deal to be made selling it out." "You don't understand what you're protecting, Ronan." Halric's mask finally fell away completely, something bitter and long buried twisting his familiar face into someone Lillian barely recognized. "You think this kingdom rewards loyalty? I've spent 30 years managing your treasury, building the wealth that funds every war you've ever fought, every alliance you've ever brokered, and what have I gotten for it? A council seat, a title with no real power. While you sit on a throne you were simply born into, never once questioning whether you actually earned the right to rule over men sharper than you'll ever be. So you sold us to Garmith." Ronan's voice had gone deathly quiet. "You sold an entire village to a man who burns first and asks questions never, because you decided you deserved more than a council seat." "I deserved a kingdom of my own." Halric's chin lifted, defiant even now, even cornered. "Garmith promised the Thorn family sovereignty over the eastern territories once Blackthorn fell. Not a council seat handed down by a cousin who never once thanked me for the decades I spent keeping his treasury solvent while he played at being a beloved king. An actual crown, Ronan. Something I earned instead of inherited." Lillian watched something break completely behind Ronan's eyes, 30 years of family loyalty collapsing into a fury so absolute it seemed to steady him rather than destroy him, the way grief sometimes hardens into something usable right before it would otherwise consume a man entirely. "Guards," Ronan said, voice flat and final. "Take him to the dungeon. He answers for every life lost in Thornfield before this is finished." But Halric's eyes had already shifted past Ronan toward the hall's eastern entrance, and something in his expression sharpened into grim, desperate satisfaction. "You're already too late, cousin," he said. "You think I'd walk in here without insurance?" The doors at the eastern entrance burst open before anyone could react, and 6 members of Ronan's own personal guard, men who had stood watch outside his chambers for years, men Ronan trusted with his very life, stormed into the hall with weapons already drawn, moving not to defend their king, but to surround him. A predator wearing a familiar face is the most dangerous predator there is, because the body never learns to flinch from a threat. It's spent years training itself to trust. "Captain Reyes," Ronan's voice cracked with disbelief as he recognized the man leading the betraying guards, a soldier who had personally saved his life during the Korath War, a man who had stood at his side through a decade of campaigns. "You too." "Halric's gold spends the same as anyone's, my king." Reyes's voice carried no apology, only cold pragmatism. "Garmith's been buying loyalty inside these walls for over a year. You were too busy chasing a missing wife to notice your own household crumbling around you." Lillian's blood ran cold as she counted the betraying guards, 6 armed men positioned strategically around the hall's exits, cutting off every clean line of retreat. Garrick's own household guard, summoned for the confrontation, were outnumbered and caught off guard, weapons only half drawn before Reyes's men closed the distance. "This ends now, Ronan," Halric said, already backing toward the eastern doors as the betraying guards moved to block any pursuit. Garmeth's second warband crosses the southern border at dawn, twice the strength of the first. Your eastern defenses are already compromised, your inner circle is already fractured, and your own people are going to watch their king fall not to an outside invader, but to the rot he let grow inside his own walls because he was too arrogant to imagine his own blood could ever betray him. "Stop him!" Ronan snarled, but Rhea's men closed ranks faster than Garrick's guards could respond. Steel meeting steel in a sudden chaotic clash that filled the great hall with the scream of clashing blades. Lillian shifted without hesitation, fur the color of moonlit ash exploding across her body in a fraction of a second, and tore into the nearest betraying guard with a brutal, practiced efficiency that 3 months ago would have been unthinkable for the careful, quiet woman she used to be. Around her, the hall dissolved into violent chaos, Garrick's loyal guards fighting desperately against men who knew every weakness in the castle's defenses because they'd helped build them. And through the haze of steel and blood, Lillian watched Halric slip through the eastern doors and vanish into the night, his betrayal complete, his escape already calculated down to the second. Scene shift. The Great Hall, minutes later, the aftermath. The fighting ended as quickly as it began, 3 of the betraying guards dead on the stone floor, 2 captured and bound, Reyes himself cut down by Garrick's own blade in the final brutal exchange. Ronan stood in the center of the wreckage, blood matting his torn shirt, his chest heaving, staring at the open eastern doors where his own cousin had just escaped into the darkness, with a confession that promised the kingdom's collapse was already in motion. "My king." Garrick's voice was hoarse, exhausted, blood dripping from a shallow cut along his forearm. "We need to move. If Garmeth's second warband is already crossing the southern border, we have hours, not days, to prepare." Ronan didn't answer immediately. He stood frozen in the center of the hall, staring at the bodies of men he'd trusted with his life, the wreckage of 30 years of family loyalty and a decade of military brotherhood collapsing into something he could no longer afford to believe in blindly. "Ronan." Lillian shifted back, blood-streaked and breathing hard, crossing the hall toward him with an urgency that finally seemed to break through his shock. "Ronan, look at me." He turned, and what she saw on his face stopped her cold. Not the careful, controlled king who'd built an entire reign on calm, measured competence. Something rawer, something that looked dangerously close to a man whose entire understanding of his own life had just been pulled out from under him in the space of 10 violent minutes. "Everyone I trusted," he said, voice hollow. "My own cousin, my own captain, men I would have died for, men who watched my back through wars that nearly killed me, and they sold me to Garmeth the moment the price was right." His hands were shaking, not from exhaustion alone. "How many more, Lily? How many more people standing in this castle right now are just waiting for the right moment to put a blade in my back?" "I don't know." She kept her voice steady, even though her own pulse was still hammering from the fight. "But I know we don't have time to fall apart over that question right now. Garmeth's warband is already moving. If you collapse under the weight of this betrayal, Ronan, you hand him exactly what Halric promised. A kingdom too broken from the inside to defend itself from the outside." Something shifted behind his eyes, grief and fury burning down into something harder, colder, more focused. The same transformation Lillian had felt in herself the night she walked out of this castle 3 months ago and finally stopped waiting to be saved. A king who survives betrayal does not survive by clinging to the soft, trusting version of himself that made the betrayal possible in the first place. He survives by becoming something the traitors never accounted for, something sharper, something that no longer assumes safety, simply because a face looks familiar. "Garrick." Ronan's voice came out different now, harder, stripped of the exhausted uncertainty that had defined him for 3 days. "I want every remaining member of my personal guard questioned before dawn. Loyalty tested, not assumed. I want the southern border reinforced with everyone we can spare, and I want word sent to every allied house within riding distance that Blackthorn territory is calling in every debt owed to this crown." "Yes, my king." Garrick's exhaustion didn't dim the relief flickering across his face at hearing his king's voice find its edge again. Ronan turned to Lillian, and the look in his eyes had changed completely from the desperate, grieving man who'd stood in this hall 10 minutes earlier. I can't fight what's coming the way I've fought everything else, he said quietly. Not as the king who trusted blindly and got his kingdom bled out from the inside for it. Garmeth's not just bringing an army at dawn, Lily. He's bringing the proof that I built this entire reign on a foundation soft enough for anyone close to me to crack open whenever they decided I was worth selling. His jaw tightened, something cold and absolute settling into his expression. That ends tonight. Whatever king I have to become to keep what's left of this kingdom standing, I'm becoming him before the sun rises. Because the man I was 3 days ago doesn't survive what's coming for us at dawn. Outside, far past the southern border, the first scouts of Cassius Garmeth's second war band were already moving through the dark, twice the strength of the force that had burned Thornfield, marching toward a kingdom that had just discovered, in the most violent way possible, exactly how rotten its own walls had grown from the inside, while its king was busy looking everywhere except where the real danger had been standing all along. The southern wall stood lit by torchlight when Lillian reached it, 3 hours before dawn. Every soldier Ronan could spare lining the ramparts in grim, exhausted silence, and the sight of it made something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the night air. Too few. Even from this distance, even without a soldier's eye for numbers, she could count the gaps where men should have been standing and weren't, the thin line of defenders stretched across a wall built to hold 3 times their current strength. Garrick met her at the base of the rampart stairs, his face carved from exhaustion and something harder underneath it, the look of a man who'd spent the last 3 hours doing math that kept coming out wrong no matter how many times he ran it. "How bad?" Lillian said. "Bad." Garrick didn't soften it. "We lost 6 men in the Great Hall fight. Another dozen pulled from Eastern patrol duty to reinforce here, which means the eastern border's nearly bare if Garmeth decides to split his force. We've got maybe 200 fighters on this wall, my lady. Scouts put his second war band at close to 2,000. 10 to 1. Lillian's pulse kicked hard against her throat, and underneath the fear something colder and more useful began turning over in her mind. The same clarity that had carried her out of this castle 3 months ago, now sharpening itself against an impossible problem. A wolf cornered by numbers she cannot outmatch does not waste breath mourning the math. She looks for the one variable the enemy hasn't accounted for, because somewhere in an army that size, arrogance always leaves a door open. "Where's Ronan?" "Up top. He hasn't come down since he climbed those stairs 2 hours ago." Garrick's jaw tightened. "He's not the same man who stood in that hall tonight, my lady. Something in him changed when Halric walked out that door. I don't know if that's good or bad yet." Lillian climbed the rampart stairs 2 at a time, the cold stone biting through her boots, and found Ronan standing at the wall's edge, staring south into a darkness that hid an army he couldn't yet see but could already feel, the way a man feels a storm pressing against his skin before the first cloud breaks the horizon. He'd changed out of the blood-stained shirt from the Great Hall, dressed now in plain dark leather, sword at his hip, no crown, no royal insignia, nothing that marked him as a king, instead of simply another soldier waiting to die on this wall, if it came to that. Something about the absence of every symbol he'd worn for 15 years struck Lillian harder than she expected. "You stripped the crown," she said, stopping beside him. "A crown doesn't stop a blade." His voice came out flat, stripped of the exhausted desperation from hours earlier. "Tonight, I'm not fighting as a king who trusted the wrong people and got an entire village burned for it. Tonight, I'm just a man with a sword standing on a wall, same as every soldier up here. That's the only version of me that has any business asking these people to die beside him." Lillian studied his profile in the torchlight, the hard set of his jaw, the new stillness in his eyes that hadn't been there even an hour after Halric's betrayal first cracked him open. "You're different," she said. "I had to become different." His hands gripped the stone parapet, knuckles whitening. "Everything I built this reign on, family loyalty, the assumption that blood and history meant something more solid than ambition? That man got 6 soldiers killed tonight, and he's about to get 200 more killed at dawn if he doesn't disappear completely." His eyes finally cut to hers, something raw and absolute burning behind them. "I don't have anything soft left to lose, Lily. Halric took it, so whatever's left standing on this wall when the sun comes up, it's not going to be the king who let his own kingdom rot from the inside because he was too comfortable to question the men closest to him." A scout's horn cut through the darkness from somewhere along the southern ridge. 3 sharp blasts that sent every soldier on the wall snapping to full attention, weapons gripped tighter, breath held. Garrick's voice carried up from the base of the stairs, urgent. "My king, they're here." Scene shift. The rampart. Minutes later. Torches bloomed across the southern ridge like a slow-spreading wound. Hundreds of them, then more, until the entire tree line glowed orange against the pre-dawn dark, and the sound that followed, the low rolling growl of nearly 2,000 wolves shifting and snarling in unison, rolled across the open ground like the opening note of something that had no intention of stopping until everything in its path was ash. Lillian's heart slammed against her ribs hard enough to hurt. Beside her, Ronan had gone utterly still, the particular stillness of a man calculating exactly how many of the soldiers around him were about to die because of mistakes that weren't entirely his fault and were entirely his responsibility anyway. Cassius Garmeth emerged at the head of his war band on the ridge, massive and scarred. The wound Lillian had carved into his shoulder weeks ago barely visible now beneath fresh battle paint, and his voice carried across the open field with the carrying, contemptuous ease of a man who already considered the outcome decided. "Blackthorn," his voice rolled across the silence like distant thunder. "I told your little wolf this wasn't finished. I always keep that kind of promise." Ronan's hands tightened on the parapet. Beside him, Garrick leaned close, voice low and urgent. "My king, we cannot hold this wall against those numbers. Not in open defense. We need to consider. I know what we need to consider." Ronan didn't look away from the ridge. "Sound the eastern recall. Every patrol still stationed there. I want them riding for this wall within the hour." "My king, that strips the eastern border entirely. If this is a feint, if he sends a second force around, it's not a feint, Garrick. Look at the formation." Ronan's eyes had gone sharp, calculating in a way Lillian recognized from the war room weeks ago, the soldier underneath the grieving husband finally rising back to the surface. He's not splitting his force. He's bringing everything to one point because he wants this finished in a single night. He doesn't need subtlety anymore. Halric already handed him the blueprint of every weakness in this kingdom. Lillian's mind raced. 3 months of brutal Grey Watch training colliding with 15 years of absorbing court strategy she'd never been allowed to voice out loud. "Then we don't fight him where he expects." Both men turned to her. "Explain," Ronan said. "He's bringing 2,000 wolves to break a wall held by 200 soldiers in a straight, brutal collision because he assumes that's the only kind of fight you know how to give him. Open ground, open numbers, the math already decided before the first blow lands." Lillian's pulse was steady now, the fear sharpening into something usable the same way it had the night of the first attack. "Marin's warband is camped 4 miles north, holding position exactly where we agreed to wait in case Garmeth moved again. If you draw his forces into the killing ground between this wall and the river gorge, narrow terrain his numbers can't fully spread into, Marin's fighters hit his flank from the tree line before he ever realizes there's a second force on this field at all." Garrick's eyes widened slightly. "You're suggesting we let him breach the outer defense?" "I'm suggesting we make him think he's winning long enough to walk his army into a trap his arrogance won't let him see coming." Lillian's gaze held steady on Ronan. Cassius Garmeth has spent a decade building a reputation on the idea that nothing stands in his way once he decides to take it. Men like that stop checking their flanks. They stop imagining anyone could outthink them because they've never had to before. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that wasn't quite the desperate grief from hours earlier, something closer to the look he used to wear in war councils 15 years ago, before peace made him soft and comfortable and blind to exactly the kind of rot that had just cost him his own cousin's loyalty. A king who survives this night does not survive by refusing to bend his strategy. He survives by becoming exactly as ruthless and exactly as patient as the men trying to bury him, because mercy toward his own pride is the one luxury a cornered kingdom can no longer afford. "Send word to Marin," he said. "Tell her the trap is set for the river gorge. We hold the wall just long enough to look broken, then fall back in controlled retreat, drawing his forces into the narrow ground." His eyes cut to Garrick. "And get every archer we have left positioned along the gorge ridge before his front line ever reaches it." Yes, my king. Garrick moved fast, shouting orders down the rampart stairs, soldiers scrambling into new positions with the controlled urgency of men who'd just been handed something better than blind hope, an actual plan. Ronan turned back to Lillian, something complicated moving behind his exhausted eyes. You came back to expose Halric. You didn't have to stay for this. I'm not staying for you. Her voice came out steady, drawing the same hard line she'd drawn in his study hours earlier. I'm staying because Marin's fighters are about to bleed for this kingdom too, and I'm not letting that happen without standing in the fight myself. Something that looked almost like respect, almost like grief for everything he'd lost the right to ask for, moved across his face. Then let's give Cassius Garmith a war he didn't plan for, he said. Scene shift. The southern wall, the first assault. The first wave hit the wall like a flood breaking a dam, 200 Garmith wolves surging across the open field with a speed that ate the distance in seconds, and Lillian shifted at the exact moment the first enemy fighter cleared the wall's outer ditch, for the color of moonlit ash exploding across her body as she dropped into the chaos alongside soldiers twice her size and half her speed. The sound was the first thing that hit her, a wall of noise that swallowed every individual scream into one continuous roar, steel and snarling and the wet percussive thud of bodies colliding at full speed. She drove into the fight low, using the leverage Dax had beaten into her bones across 3 brutal months, and felt her teeth close around the throat of an enemy wolf twice her weight before her own body had fully processed the danger of the strike. Around her, Blackthorn soldiers fought with the desperate, focused brutality of men defending the only home they had left. But the numbers told their own story even in the first minutes. For every enemy Wolf cut down, 2 more surged through the gap, climbing over the bodies of their own dead with a cold, mechanical hunger that spoke of an army that had been promised victory and didn't intend to be denied it. Ronan fought near the gate itself, blood already matting his fur dark, his movements carrying the controlled brutality of a man who'd buried every soft, trusting instinct hours ago and replaced it with something colder, something built purely for survival. He cut down an enemy fighter with a single brutal strike, then spun to meet the next attacker without a single wasted motion, every ounce of 15 years of war experience compressed into a fight where hesitation meant death. A war does not reward the man who fights with the heart he had yesterday. It rewards the man willing to become whatever the battlefield requires of him tonight, even if what it requires looks nothing like the king he was this morning. Fall back, Garrick's voice cut through the chaos, the signal they'd agreed on, the careful, controlled retreat designed to look like a wall breaking under pressure it couldn't withstand. Fall back to the gorge, Lillian disengaged from the fight, tearing free of an enemy wolf's grip with a vicious twist that left a chunk of fur and skin behind, and fell into the retreating formation alongside the rest of the Blackthorn soldiers, every step calculated to look desperate, panicked, beaten, while underneath the performance, her wolf's mind stayed sharp and focused on the narrow gorge terrain waiting half a mile north. Cassius Garmoth's voice rolled across the chaos behind them, triumphant, certain. They're breaking! Press forward! Don't let them regroup! Exactly the response they'd hoped for. Scene shift. The river gorge. Minutes later, the retreat funneled the Blackthorn forces into the narrow gorge exactly as planned, steep rock walls rising on either side of the river, ground too tight for Garmith's full numbers to spread into formation, and Lillian felt her pulse hammering as she counted the seconds until Marin's archers, hidden along the upper ridge, would have the entire enemy column locked into the killing ground. Cassius led the pursuit himself, fur the color of dried blood streaked with battle paint, his confidence radiating off him even from a distance as he drove his forces deeper into the gorge, chasing what he believed was a broken, fleeing enemy. He stopped at the gorge's narrowest point, something flickering across his expression that Lillian recognized too late as suspicion instead of triumph. "Hold!" he barked, and his entire warband skidded to a halt mid-pursuit, the column bunching up tight against the narrow rock walls. "He's stopping!" Ronan snarled low, shifted back to human form at the gorge's edge, blood streaming from a gash along his ribs. "He's not taking the bait." Cassius's gold eyes scanned the ridge above them, narrowed and calculating, and Lillian's chest went tight with dread as she watched him piece together exactly what they'd done. A retreat this clean, Cassius called out, voice carrying easily across the narrow gorge, isn't a broken army fleeing for its life. That's a trap, Blackthorn. You always were smarter than I gave you credit for. His head tilted, scenting the air, and his mouth curved into something cold and certain. Wolves on that ridge. Northern wolves by the scent of it. Your little Luna's friends from the Greywatch clan, I assume. Lillian's blood ran cold. He'd seen through it before Marin's archers ever had the chance to spring the ambush. Archers, now! Garrick's voice tore across the gorge, desperate, and the first volley of arrows rained down from the ridge. But Cassius was already moving, his war band scattering wide along the gorge's edges with a speed and coordination that spoke of a man who'd anticipated exactly this kind of attack and had already drilled his forces on the countermeasure. The trap, sprung half a beat too late, became something far messier than the clean ambush they'd planned. Scene shift. The gorge. The height of chaos. The fighting in the narrow gorge turned brutal and close. No clean lines, no controlled formations, just bodies crushed together in a violent scramble as Marin's archers tried to pick off targets in a melee too chaotic to aim into without risking their own allies. Lillian fought in the thick of it, blood slicking her fur, every breath burning in her lungs, and somewhere in the chaos she lost sight of Ronan entirely. Marin tore through the fighting toward her, gold eyes wild, fur matted with blood that wasn't entirely her own. He saw the trap before we sprang it, Marin snarled. He's pulling his forces wide, trying to flank our position on the ridge. Then we hold here, Lillian shouted back. We don't let him reach your archers. A massive impact slammed into her side before she finished the sentence, sending her sprawling against the gorge's rocky wall. Hard enough that pain exploded white across her vision, and she came up snarling to find Cassius Garmouth himself standing over her, blood-streaked and massive, his gold eyes burning with the particular satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered the one fighter who'd embarrassed him weeks ago. Little wolf. His voice carried a low, dangerous amusement even through the chaos surrounding them. I told you we'd finish this. He lunged, and Lillian barely rolled clear in time, his jaws snapping shut on empty air where her throat had been a half-second earlier. She scrambled back to her feet, every muscle screaming from the impact against the rock wall, and met his next attack head-on, the two of them colliding in a brutal tangle of fur and teeth that drove them both stumbling toward the river's edge. He was stronger than her, bigger, more experienced, carrying the brutal efficiency of a man who'd built a decade-long reign on exactly this kind of violence, and Lillian felt herself losing ground with every exchange, blood running hot down her flank from a gash his teeth had carved into her shoulder. A predator who survives a fight she cannot win on strength alone, does not survive by hoping the fight changes in her favor. She survives by finding the one moment her opponent's confidence makes him careless, and she makes that single moment count for everything. Cassius drove her back against a boulder at the river's edge, his full weight pinning her down, jaws closing toward her exposed throat with the unhurried confidence of a predator who believed the fight was already decided. She twisted at the last possible second, driving her hind legs up into his exposed belly with every ounce of strength 3 months of brutal Greywatch training had built into her body, and felt the impact land hard enough to send him staggering back with a roar of genuine pain. She didn't waste the opening. She drove forward, teeth sinking into the same shoulder wound she'd carved into him weeks ago, tearing it wider, and Cassius's roar turned into something closer to a scream as he wrenched himself free and staggered back, blood pouring down his foreleg. You little... His words cut off as he caught his footing, eyes blazing with fury that had burned past calculation into something purely animal. I'm going to enjoy ending you. He never got the chance to finish the threat. A horn sounded from the southern ridge, 3 sharp blasts that cut clean through the chaos of the battle, and every Garmouth wolf in the gorge went suddenly, visibly tense. Scene shift. The ridge, the same moment far to the south, riding hard with a contingent of allied house soldiers that had answered Ronan's desperate call within hours of receiving it. House Voss banners cut through the pre-dawn dark. 300 fresh fighters thundering toward the gorge, with Seraphine Voss herself riding at their head, her face hard and focused in a way that owed nothing to the careful, calculating diplomacy she'd worn during the treaty negotiations weeks earlier. Cassius's eyes snapped toward the new threat, calculating odds that had just shifted dramatically against him. And something in his expression hardened into the cold, pragmatic decision of a warlord who understood exactly when a fight had stopped being winnable. "Fall back!" he roared across the gorge, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man whose army obeyed without question. "Full retreat, now!" His forces began disengaging immediately, the brutal, coordinated discipline of an army that had drilled this exact maneuver, and Lillian watched through blood-blurred vision as Cassius himself turned to retreat, his wounded shoulder leaving a dark trail across the gorge stones. He paused at the edge of the chaos, gold eyes finding hers one final time across the bloodied ground. "This isn't a loss, little wolf," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear it over the chaos. "This is a lesson. I came here tonight to test exactly how deep the rot in Blackthorn's foundation runs, and what I found tells me everything I need to know for the next time I come back with a strategy that doesn't depend on a single traitor cousin to open the gate for me." He disappeared into the retreating chaos before she could respond, his warband melting back into the darkness of the southern ridge with the same brutal efficiency they'd arrived with, leaving the gorge littered with bodies and blood and the ringing, exhausted silence that follows violence too large to fully comprehend in the moment it ends. Scene shift. The gorge. The aftermath. Lillian shifted back to human form on shaking legs, blood streaming from the gash in her shoulder, every muscle in her body screaming from the brutal exchange with Cassius Garmith, and scanned the chaos of the gorge with rising panic that had nothing to do with her own injuries. "Ronan!" Her voice tore raw from her throat. "Ronan!" She found Garrick first, blood-soaked and exhausted, helping a wounded soldier to his feet near the gorge's narrow entrance. "Garrick, where's the king?" Garrick's face, already grim from the brutal cost of the fight, went somehow grimmer. "I lost sight of him 20 minutes ago, my lady. He was fighting near the eastern wall of the gorge when Cassius's forces flanked our position." His jaw tightened. "I sent 2 men to find him. They haven't returned." Lillian's chest seized, fear cutting through the exhaustion and pain like a blade. She shifted back to her wolf form despite every protest from her wounded shoulder and tore toward the eastern wall of the gorge, following the scent trail through chaos and blood and the scattered wreckage of bodies that marked the worst of the fighting. She found him near the base of a steep rock outcropping, human again, sword still gripped in one bloodied hand, 3 Garmouth soldiers dead around him in a tight, brutal radius that spoke of a man who'd fought desperately and well, even as the odds closed in. Ronan himself lay slumped against the rock, blood soaking through his shirt from a wound along his side, his breathing shallow and labored, his eyes barely open as she shifted back and dropped to her knees beside him. "Ronan." Her voice cracked, all the careful distance she'd maintained for 3 months collapsing in an instant at the sight of him bleeding out against cold stone. "Ronan, look at me." His eyes found hers, glassy with blood loss but still sharp enough to track her face, and something that might have been relief flickered across his expression despite the pain clearly radiating through every line of his body. "Lily." His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Did we hold the gorge?" "We held it." Garmouth retreated. Voss reinforcements arrived in time to break the numbers in our favor. She pressed both hands hard against the wound in his side, trying to stem the bleeding, her own hands shaking with a fear sharper than anything she'd felt fighting Cassius Garmouth directly. "You're going to be fine. Do you hear me? You're going to be fine. I took a blade meant for one of my own soldiers." His breath rattled wet in his chest, and the sound of it sent ice through her veins. "Young kid, couldn't have been more than 19. Garmouth fighter had him cornered against the rock, and I—" "Stop talking." Her voice broke despite every effort to keep it steady. "Save your strength. I'm not sorry." His hand found hers where it pressed against the wound, his grip weak but insistent. "Whatever happens tonight, Lily, I need you to know I'm not sorry I stepped between that blade and a kid who still had his whole life ahead of him. That's the king I should have been from the start, not the one who let his own blood rot the foundation while he sat comfortable on a throne he never had to fight to protect. You're not dying tonight." Tears blurred her vision now, fierce and unstoppable. "I didn't survive 3 months in that forest. I didn't survive Cassius Garmouth's teeth twice in one night. just to watch you bleed out on this rock, because you decided to be noble at exactly the wrong moment. A faint pained ghost of a smile crossed his bloodied face. There's the fire I should have noticed 15 years ago. His eyes fluttered closed, his body going slack against the rock, and Lillian's heart slammed against her ribs hard enough to hurt as she screamed for Garrick, for anyone, her voice tearing raw across the bloodied wreckage of the gorge while Ronan Blackthorn's breathing slowed to something dangerously close to nothing at all. The first gray light of dawn finally breaking over a battlefield that had cost this kingdom more than anyone standing in that gorge could yet fully measure. The healer's tent smelled of crushed yarrow and blood-soaked linen, and Lillian had not moved from the stool beside Ronan's cot in 11 hours. She watched his chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven increments, watched the healer press fresh poultice against the wound in his side every few hours with hands that had stopped offering false comfort somewhere around hour 6. And she understood, sitting in that silence, something she'd never let herself fully understand during 15 years of safe distance from his mortality. A man does not become precious to you because he is strong. He becomes precious because somewhere along the way, without your permission, you started measuring the shape of your own life by whether his breathing continues. Garrick appeared in the tent flap near dawn of the second day, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and the look he gave her wasn't one she wanted to read. Voss Territory's reinforcements have secured the southern ridge, he said quietly. Garmouth's forces retreated past the river border entirely. We won the night, my lady. And him. Her voice came out cracked, raw from hours of silence. What does the healer say? That the next few hours decide it. Garrick's hand found her shoulder, brief and steady. He's a fighter, Lillian. Always has been. If anyone survives a wound like that through stubbornness alone, it's him. She didn't answer. She turned back to the cot, to the gray pallor of Ronan's face, to the bandage wrapped tight around a wound that had nearly cost a kingdom its king for the sake of one 19-year-old soldier's life, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the faint, stubborn rhythm beneath her hand. Stay, she thought, and didn't let herself examine too closely what that single word cost her to admit, even silently, even alone. Scene shift. The healer's tent, hours later, the turn. His eyes opened slowly, lashes fluttering against the gray morning light filtering through the tent canvas. And the first sound out of him was a rough, pained exhale that nearly stopped Lillian's heart before she understood it was relief, not agony. Lily. His voice came out wrecked, barely a whisper. I'm here. She gripped his hand, tears she'd been holding back for 2 days finally breaking loose, hot and unstoppable down her face. I'm right here. Did we hold? We held. Garmouth's gone. Voss reinforcements broke the numbers. She pressed his hand against her cheek, needing the warmth of it, the proof of it. You scared me, Ronan. You scared me worse than anything Cassius Garmouth ever did with his teeth. A faint, exhausted ghost of a smile crossed his bloodless lips. Didn't plan on dying, figured I had unfinished business. Don't joke about that. Not yet, her voice cracked. Not when I spent 2 days not knowing if you'd open your eyes again. His grip tightened weakly around her fingers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying a weight that 15 years of careful, controlled distance had never once allowed. I meant what I said in the gorge, he said finally, voice rough but steady now. I'm not sorry. Whatever this costs me to recover from, I'm not sorry I became the kind of king willing to bleed for a soldier instead of the kind who sat safe behind a wall while other men died protecting him. Recovery, when it finally claims a man, does not arrive like a single triumphant moment. It arrives slow, humiliating, full of small defeats, a body that refuses to cooperate with the will driving it, and the kind of patience that strips away every illusion a person held about their own invincibility. Scene shift. 3 weeks later, the castle gardens. Ronan walked with a cane now, slow and deliberate steps across the gravel path of the eastern garden, his ribs still wrapped beneath his shirt, his stamina a fraction of what it had been before the gorge. Lillian walked beside him, matching his pace without comment, the way she'd matched his pace through every painful step of recovery these past 3 weeks. Present without being asked, steady, without demanding credit for it. Halrick's still out there, Ronan said, breaking a long, comfortable silence. Garrick's scouts haven't found a trace of him since he fled the Great Hall. He'll surface eventually. Men like that always do, once they think the danger's past. Lillian's voice carried no fear, only a hard, settled certainty. And when he does, you won't be the same king who trusted him blindly for 30 years. No. Ronan's jaw tightened, something old and bitter still living behind his eyes, despite the weeks of healing. I think about it every day, 30 years of family loyalty, and it took him exactly one bad deal with a man who burns villages to decide none of it mattered. He stopped walking, leaning on the cane, his breath coming a little harder from the effort. I keep asking myself how I missed it. What signs I should have seen, what conversation I should have had differently 15 years ago, 10 years ago, that might have kept him from selling out an entire kingdom for a crown of his own. Maybe there weren't signs to see. Lillian turned to face him fully, the autumn light catching the new hardness in her own eyes, hardness that hadn't been there 15 years ago either. Or maybe there were, and you missed them the same way I let myself believe waiting patiently was the same thing as being loved. We don't get to go back and fix the versions of ourselves who didn't know better yet, Ronan. We only get to decide what we build with what we know now. He studied her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. You've changed so much these past months. Sometimes I look at you and I barely recognize the woman who used to stand quietly in the corner of every council meeting. I'm not her anymore. Lillian's voice came out steady, certain in a way that owed nothing to performance. I spent 15 years believing love meant making myself smaller, so I'd never be the reason for conflict. The forest taught me that disappearing quietly isn't love, Ronan. It's just slow erasure dressed up as devotion. She held his gaze. I'm not going back to being that woman. Not for you, not for anyone. I don't want you to. His voice cracked slightly on the words, raw and unrehearsed. Lily, I have spent every day of this recovery thinking about exactly what kind of marriage I want to rebuild, if you'll even let me try. And it's not the one we had before. I don't want a quiet, devoted wife who waits in corners and never asks for anything back. I want the woman who tore into Cassius Garmuth's shoulder with her own teeth because innocent people were burning. I want the Luna who walked back into a castle that broke her heart because she understood the difference between protecting people and protecting her own pride. Lillian's breath caught, the autumn wind cutting cold across the garden, carrying the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from the kitchen fires. That's a lot to want from someone you spent 15 years not seeing at all, she said quietly. I know. He didn't look away from her, didn't retreat into the careful political composure that had defined every difficult conversation between them for 15 years. I'm not asking you to forgive that tonight, or this season, or even this year if that's what it takes. I'm asking you to let me earn it. Actually earn it, Lily, not the way I used to think loyalty was something owed to me simply because I sat on a throne and provided for a household. I want to earn the kind of trust that doesn't assume it's guaranteed just because it's always been there before. Scene shift. The council hall. 1 month later. The hall stood different now from the room Lillian remembered standing in for 15 years, the long table reconfigured into a wider circle. New faces filling seats that used to belong exclusively to old, comfortable men who'd never once questioned the king's decisions out loud. Garrick sat among them now as something closer to a true advisor than a soldier following orders, and beside the empty seat reserved for the Luna, a second new chair had been added, one Lillian had never seen in this room before. Ronan stood at the head of the table, leaning less on his cane now, 3 months of healing having returned most of his strength, though something in the careful, measured way he carried himself suggested the wound had changed him in ways that went deeper than muscle and bone. The reforms stand as discussed, he said, addressing the assembled council with a directness that hadn't existed in this room before the gorge. Every household with a seat at this table will be reviewed for loyalty, not assumed innocent because of bloodline or history. We nearly lost this kingdom because I built 30 years of trust on the lazy assumption that family meant safety. That assumption nearly cost 200 soldiers their lives and burned an entire village to ash. It doesn't happen again. A murmur moved through the council, some approving, some clearly uncomfortable with a king willing to interrogate his own inner circle this openly, but none of them argued. Second, Ronan continued, every decision regarding alliance, treaty, or war moves through this council and through my Luna before it's finalized, not as a formality, as an actual requirement. His eyes found Lillian's across the room, something steady and certain passing between them. I spent 15 years making decisions in isolation and calling it strength. It wasn't strength, it was arrogance wearing strength's clothing, and this kingdom paid for that arrogance in blood that didn't have to be spilled. Lillian rose from her seat, the council's attention shifting to her with a respect she'd never once been given in this room during 15 years of standing quietly in corners. I have one addition, she said, her voice carrying clear and unshaking across the hall. The Northern Territories, the Grey Watch clan, and the other forgotten packs who've survived in those wilds for generations without a single crown ever offering them protection or recognition, they fought and bled for this kingdom in the Gorge. Marin's warriors saved lives that night that your soldiers couldn't have saved alone. I want formal recognition of the Grey Watch clan as an allied territory, not subjects, not vassals, allies with full standing and full voice in any future council that affects Northern land. Silence settled over the hall, several council members exchanging uneasy glances, the old guard clearly unprepared for a Luna who spoke with this much unshakable authority. Ronan held her gaze for a long moment, something proud and certain settling behind his eyes. Agreed, he said simply, and the finality in his voice closed the discussion before anyone in the council found the nerve to object. Scene shift. The Northern Road, 2 months later. Lillian rode north alone, the same road she'd walked exhausted and broken 8 months earlier, except now the journey carried none of the desperate, fleeing weight it had carried then. She rode as herself, fully, the Luna of Blackthorn territory and a daughter of the Grey Watch clan both. Two identities that had once felt impossible to hold together now settled into her chest with an ease that still occasionally surprised her. Marin met her at the edge of the settlement, gold eyes warm in a way Lillian had rarely seen on the older woman's scarred face. "You look different," Marin said, studying her with the same sharp assessment she'd used the first night they met. "Steadier." "I feel steadier." Lillian dismounted, embracing the older woman with a familiarity that had grown between them through months of training and now months of negotiated peace between two territories that had never once acknowledged each other's existence before this past year. The council ratified the alliance formally last week. Your warriors will have full voice in any decision affecting Northern land going forward. No more invisible territory the Crown pretends doesn't exist. Marin's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, something deeper. Your husband's kingdom owes the Grey Watch clan more than a council seat, but I'll take the seat as a start. You studied Lillian carefully. And you? Have you decided what you actually want, girl, now that the dust has settled and nobody's forcing your hand anymore? The question landed with a weight Lillian had been circling for weeks, ever since Ronan's recovery had stabilized enough that the urgency of survival stopped drowning out every quieter, more complicated question underneath it. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I know I'm not the woman who left this place 8 months ago. I know I'm never going back to being someone who waits quietly to be noticed. But what I feel for Ronan now, it's different from what I felt for him before. It's not blind devotion anymore. It's something I have to actively choose every day, with my eyes open to exactly who he is and exactly what he's capable of becoming if he stops doing the work." "That's not a flaw in the feeling," Marin said. "That's the only kind of love worth having, girl. The kind you choose with your eyes open instead of the kind you fall into blind and call destiny." Her gold eyes softened. "Whatever you decide, the Grey Watch clan will always have a place for you. That much never changes." Scene shift. The castle, 4 months after the Gorge. A quiet evening. The fire burned low in the private study, the same room where Halric had once stood pouring wine with the easy familiarity of a man Ronan had trusted his entire life. Though the room itself felt different now, repainted, refurnished, stripped of the particular shadows that betrayal had left soaked into the walls. Ronan sat across from Lillian, 2 cups of tea between them instead of wine. The simple domesticity of the scene, carrying a weight neither of them rushed to fill with words. "I had a letter from Halric," he said finally. Lillian's spine straightened. "Where is he?" "I don't know. The letter wasn't signed with a location, just delivered by an anonymous courier who claimed no knowledge of its origin." Ronan's jaw tightened, old grief still living in the lines of his face whenever the subject surfaced. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even try to justify himself further. He just wrote that he hoped I understood, someday, that ambition and betrayal aren't always opposite forces. Sometimes they're the same hunger wearing different names. "Do you believe that?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I believe my cousin wanted something I never gave him a real chance to earn, honestly. That doesn't excuse what he did. Children died because of his choices, Lily. Soldiers I trusted with my life turned their blades on their own brothers because his gold spoke louder than any oath they'd sworn." His voice hardened. "But I also understand now, in a way I didn't before the Gorge, that a kingdom built entirely on inherited loyalty instead of earned respect is a kingdom one disappointed man away from collapse. I gave Halric 30 years of assuming he'd always be satisfied with whatever I handed him, because handing things down had always worked for every king before me. I never once asked him what he actually wanted for himself. That's not an excuse for what he did." "No," Ronan agreed. "It's not an excuse. It's a lesson I paid for in blood, and I intend to spend the rest of this reign making sure no one else under this roof feels invisible enough that betrayal starts looking like the only door left open to them." His eyes found hers across the firelight. "The way I let you feel invisible, for 15 years, until a forest clan and a war taught me what I should have understood the day I married you." The honesty in his voice, raw and unguarded, settled into the quiet study like something neither of them had earned the right to rush past. "I forgave you for that a while ago," Lillian said softly. "Not because you finished earning it completely. Because I watched you change in ways that weren't performance, Ronan. I watched you bleed out on a rock for a 19-year-old soldier you'd never met before that night. I watched you restructure your entire council, your entire approach to power, because you finally understood the cost of building a kingdom on assumptions instead of attention." She set her tea down, meeting his eyes fully. "I don't carry the resentment anymore, but I also can't go back to being the woman who waited quietly for whatever scraps of attention you had left over after the kingdom took its share. I would never ask you to be her again." His voice was rough, certain. "I don't want her back, Lily. I want the woman sitting across from me right now, the one who tells me hard truths instead of swallowing them to keep the peace, the one who built an entire alliance with the Greywatch clan because she understood exactly what it cost to be the territory everyone forgets exists." Scene shift. The Eastern Village, 6 months after the Gorge. The rebuilding Thornfield had risen from its ashes slower than anyone expected, the rebuilding work stretching across months of careful labor. But standing in the village square now, watching new timber frames rise against a clear autumn sky, Lillian felt something close to peace settle into her chest for the first time since the night the watchtower went dark. Ronan walked the construction site beside her, no longer leaning on a cane, his stride steady and sure despite the scar that still pulled tight along his ribs whenever he twisted the wrong way. He stopped to speak with an elderly farmer rebuilding his grain store, listening with a patience and genuine attention that the Ronan of a year ago had never once demonstrated toward anyone outside his immediate council. A king who survives betrayal does not become whole again by pretending the wound never happened. He becomes whole by letting the scar teach him exactly where he used to be blind, and by choosing, every single day after, to look in that direction on purpose, instead of waiting for another crisis to force his eyes open. "You're good at this now," Lillian said as he rejoined her, watching the farmer return to his work with renewed energy, clearly heartened by his king's attention. "I had a lot of time lying in that healer's tent to think about what kind of king I wanted to become if I survived." Ronan's eyes scanned the rebuilding village, something steady and resolved settling into his expression. "I kept thinking about Halric's letter, about ambition and betrayal being the same hunger wearing different names. I started wondering how many people in this kingdom feel invisible right now, the way he felt invisible, the way you felt invisible, simply because I never thought to ask what they needed beyond what I assumed they should be grateful for." "And what did you decide?" That a king who actually listens doesn't eliminate every potential betrayal. People are still going to want things they can't have, still going to make choices that hurt the people around them. But a king who listens at least gives fewer people a reason to believe betrayal is their only remaining option. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the middle of the rebuilding square. I'm not the same man who let you disappear for 8 days without noticing, Lily. I check now. Every single day I check who's standing quietly in the corners of every room I walk into, because I learned the hard way exactly what that silence costs if it goes unnoticed long enough. Lillian studied him in the autumn light, the new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, the steadiness in his stance that had replaced the brittle, controlled exhaustion of a king who'd spent 15 years assuming strength meant never showing a single crack. I think I finally believe you, she said quietly. That means more to me than you know. His hand found hers, gentle, asking rather than assuming. I'm not going to pretend the next chapter of this is going to be simple, Lily. We have a kingdom still recovering from war, a traitor still out there somewhere who might resurface, alliances still being rebuilt with territories that never trusted Blackthorn to begin with. But I want to build whatever comes next with you standing beside me as my equal, not behind me as someone I forgot to introduce to my own decisions. Scene shift. The coronation grounds, 1 year after the night she walked out before dawn. The grounds outside Blackthorn Castle had been transformed for the ceremony, banners from a dozen allied territories snapping in the crisp autumn wind, Greywatch warriors standing alongside Blackthorn soldiers in a formation that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, two peoples who'd spent generations ignoring each other's existence, now standing shoulder to shoulder as genuine allies. Lillian stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, dressed not in the careful, formal silks the court used to insist on, but in something simpler, sturdier, fabric that honored both her royal title and the northern blood that had reshaped her over the past year. Marin stood nearby, gold eyes sharp and proud, watching the ceremony unfold with the satisfaction of a woman who'd helped forge something genuinely new out of two worlds that had never once intersected before. Ronan stood at the center of the platform, the formal blackthorn crown resting on a velvet cushion beside him, his eyes finding Lillian's across the crowd, with a steadiness that carried none of the careless distraction of the king she'd married 15 years ago. The ceremony itself moved through its formal stages, the renewal of alliances, the public acknowledgement of the Greywatch clan standing, the careful, deliberate restructuring of a kingdom that had nearly burned to ash because one king spent too many years assuming loyalty was owed instead of earned. But the moment that mattered, the moment the entire gathered crowd seemed to lean into with held breath, came when Ronan turned from the formal proceedings and walked down from the platform, crossing the open ground toward where Lillian stood at the crowd's edge. He stopped in front of her, and the murmur of the crowd fell into an expectant hush. "There's a second crown," he said, his voice carrying clear across the silent grounds, "that this kingdom has never properly given its Luna. Not because the position didn't exist, but because I spent 15 years treating it like a formality, instead of an honor that has to be chosen, not simply inherited through marriage." He gestured, and an attendant brought forward a second cushion, a Luna's crown resting on dark velvet, simpler than the king's crown, but unmistakably its equal in weight and meaning. "I'm not placing this on your head," he said, his voice dropping lower, meant only for her despite the watching crowd. "I learned the hard way that I don't get to decide what you accept simply because I've decided I want to give it. This crown is yours to take, Lily, if and only if it's what you actually want. Not because the kingdom expects its king to have a crowned Luna standing beside him. Not because you feel obligated after everything we've survived together. Only if standing here, in front of everyone who watched you walk away a year ago and watched you come back to save a kingdom that didn't deserve you, this is the choice you actually want to make." The crowd held its silence, and Lillian looked down at the crown resting on its velvet cushion, then up at the man standing in front of her, scarred now in ways both visible and invisible, fundamentally changed from the careless, distracted king who'd ridden out of this same courtyard a year ago without a single backward glance. A wolf does not become an equal by being granted power. She becomes an equal the day someone finally understands that her choice was always the only thing that could make any power between them mean something real. "A year ago," she said, her voice carrying clear across the silent grounds, addressing not just Ronan, but the entire gathered crowd. Blackthorn soldiers and Grey Watch warriors and allied nobles all watching with held breath. I left this castle before dawn because I'd spent 15 years waiting to matter to a man who never thought to ask what I needed. I walked into a forest expecting to die there, and instead I found people who taught me that survival isn't about waiting patiently to be chosen. It's about choosing yourself first every single day until the people around you finally understand that your presence was never something owed to them. She looked at Ronan, and something fierce and certain settled behind her eyes. I'm not accepting this crown because I need a king to make my life mean something. I have meaning that belongs entirely to me now, built in a forest you never thought to look in, earned through battles you watched me fight beside you as an equal, not as a wife waiting safely behind your protection. Her hand reached for the crown, lifting it from its velvet cushion. I'm accepting this because for the first time in 15 years, the man offering it actually understands the difference between owning something and earning the right to stand beside it. She placed the crown on her own head, the gesture deliberate, unmistakable, a Luna crowning herself by her own hand in front of a kingdom that had spent 15 years assuming her presence was guaranteed. The crowd erupted, a roar of approval that rolled across the grounds, like the tide finally breaking after a long-held silence. Blackthorn soldiers and Grey Watch warriors alike raising their voices together for a Luna who had earned her crown through fire instead of simply inheriting it through marriage. Ronan's eyes were wet, something raw and unguarded, breaking across his face as he watched her. And when he stepped forward to take her hand, it wasn't a king claiming his queen. It was a man reaching for an equal who had chosen, with her eyes fully open, to stand beside him. Scene shift. The castle gardens that evening, the final quiet. The ceremony's noise had faded into the soft murmur of evening celebration somewhere behind them, and Lillian stood alone with Ronan in the same eastern garden where he'd first asked her to let him earn back what he'd lost, the autumn air carrying the scent of wood smoke and the last dying roses of the season. "You surprised me today," Ronan said quietly, his hand finding hers in the fading light. "I expected you to take the crown from my hands. I didn't expect you to take it from your own." "I had to." Lillian's voice carried a peace that hadn't existed in her 15 years ago, a peace built not on the absence of conflict, but on the presence of a self she'd finally stopped apologizing for. "I spent too many years letting other people's hands decide what I was allowed to have, even your hands, even with the best intentions behind them. I needed the kingdom to see, and I needed myself to feel that nothing about who I am now depends on permission from anyone, including you. I understand that." His thumb traced slow, gentle circles against her palm. "I think that's exactly the lesson I needed this past year, too. Not that I should hand you more power, but that I needed to stop being the one deciding when and how you got to have it in the first place." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade behind the castle towers, two people who'd survived betrayal from the inside and invasion from the outside, who'd both been forced to burn down the versions of themselves that nearly cost everything, and who'd somehow found their way to standing here, equals in a way that 15 years of careful, distant devotion had never once allowed. True strength, Lillian understood now, watching the stars emerge over a kingdom finally rebuilding itself on something steadier than blind trust and quiet sacrifice, was never about commanding obedience from the people around you. It was about surviving the moment everything you built collapsed, and choosing, with open eyes and a body that remembered every scar, to rebuild something honest instead of simply rebuilding what was comfortable. Every betrayal that had cracked this kingdom open, Halrich's gold-bought treason, Cassius Garmeth's decade of patient hunger, 15 years of a husband too distracted to notice his own wife disappearing in plain sight, had stripped away every illusion either of them once carried about safety being something inherited instead of earned. What remained, standing together in the quiet garden as the last light faded into full dark, wasn't the fragile peace of two people who'd simply survived. It was something harder won, something neither of them would ever again take for granted. A partnership built by two people who understood exactly what it cost to lose each other and had chosen, with full knowledge of that cost, to stay anyway. Far to the north, The Grey Watch settlement burned its evening fires under a sky the same wolves had watched for generations before any crown existed to claim these lands. And far to the south, somewhere beyond Blackthorn's borders, Cassius Garmith nursed old wounds and waited for a future war that would not be told in this story, while a traitor named Halric Thorn walked roads under a different name, carrying a betrayal he would spend the rest of his days failing to fully justify to himself. But in the garden, beneath a sky finally clear of smoke for the first time in over a year, a king and his Luna stood together as equals, their crowns earned instead of simply given, their love rebuilt on the unshakable foundation of having survived the absolute worst of each other and choosing, with eyes wide open, to remain. The rain that followed became legend not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. And in a kingdom that had nearly burned for the sin of pretending otherwise, honesty was the only crown that ever truly lasted.